Welcome, to the Cursed Hour, where every whisper in the dark, every creak in the floor, might be something watching threes. If you found this channel, you're already part of the curse. The Note at Midnight. I live in a small home in a fairly decent neighborhood, and I also work from home as well. My world was quiet, predictable, until a stranger's gaze shattered that illusion. I have my office set up upstairs in a small room with my desk right by a window that faces the front of the house. I loved the view, the breeze, the sense of safety until it betrayed me. His shadow still lingers, and that note, with my name scrawled in jagged letters, haunts every quiet moment. I don't know who he was, but I know he wanted me to open the door. I liked being able to open it for fresh air or have the view when it was nice out. The neighborhood was a patchwork of tidy lawns and friendly waves, a place where nothing ever happened. One regular weekday, I was doing my usual work at my desk when I noticed something out the window. It was subtle at first, a flicker of movement that didn't belong. There was a person, a man, standing at the bottom of my driveway, not walking past it or stopping to tie a shoe or anything. He was still, his eyes fixed on my house, unblinking. He was just standing there and looking up at my house. I couldn't look away. I couldn't tell if he could see me in the window or not. But after only a few seconds of me looking at him, he walked away. His departure was too quick, too deliberate, as if he knew I'd seen him. I thought it was really strange, but that was about it. What else was I supposed to think or do? I tried to shake it off, to focus on my spreadsheets. I continued with work. I did an occasional check out the window every now and again, but seeing nothing else, I wasn't too worried about it. But the unease clung, a quiet warning I ignored. He came back. The following day, I was on the same routine. I got to work and was pretty busy the whole day. My screen glowed with video calls, my voice steady despite the chaos brewing outside. I had a lot of video calls with my coworkers. During one of these calls, I spaced out and happened to glance out the window again. There he was, a dark silhouette against the daylight. That man was there, standing in the same spot at the end of the driveway and looking up at the house, just like he was before. His presence was heavier this time, a weight pressing against my chest. Something about this time was 10 times more creepy and eerie. Why the hell was he back here? I was trapped in his gaze. I must have stared off at him for a while because one of my coworkers noticed. I looked worried and asked if everything was okay. My voice cracked as I lied. I said yeah and tried to refocus on the meeting. I kept looking back, though. He was standing there for a minute. Each glance confirmed he was still there, unmoving, relentless. Then I looked back again, and he was gone. The empty driveway mocked me, its normalcy a lie. The rest of my workday felt a drag on. I couldn't stop thinking about this random guy looking up at my house. It was just so odd. I needed answers. When I got out of work, I went outside and walked around my driveway, looking for any reason for them to be looking up at my house like that. The pavement was clean, the hedges untouched. Everything looked normal. However, I did notice that the window of my office was visible and clear from where the man was standing, which means he could likely see me looking at him. The realization hit hard. He'd seen me, known I was watching. I went back inside and made dinner. The knife felt heavy in my hand, the house too quiet. I had a call with my brother that night, and I mentioned it. He tried to calm me. He agreed it was odd, but said it was likely nothing. But his words couldn't erase the image of that man's stare. After getting off the phone, I sat down and watched TV, hoping to get my mind off of it. The screen flickered, but my mind was elsewhere, A couple hours passed. I had the show turned down because I was getting tired, but with the low volume, I was able to hear what I thought were footsteps outside my house. The sound was soft, deliberate, a predator circling. I jolted up from the couch and stared at the front door. He was closer now. The footsteps walked up, only stopping for a brief second, then walked away. My pulse raced, every nerve alight. I hurried over to the door and looked out the peephole. I could only faintly see a figure walking down to the road. He was a shadow, slipping into the night. Once they were gone, I opened the door. Immediately, I noticed a note taped to the back. It was small, crumpled, the handwriting sharp. It was short. It just said, "Pat, answer the door." My name, written by a stranger, felt like a violation. I was not only confused, but horrified. How did they know my name? I called for help. And what was the note even supposed to mean? They didn't even knock or stay long enough for me to have answered the door. Not that I would have anyway. The police were my only option. This was enough for me to call the police. 2 officers came over, and I told them everything. I showed them the note, my hands trembling. Unfortunately, there wasn't all that much they could do, though. They pretty much wrote it all down and said, "If something else happens, call them." Their words were hollow, offering no comfort. It really didn't make me feel much better. Sleep was impossible. I stayed up late that night, laying in bed, unable to sleep. I literally just laid there for hours thinking about this man that was stalking my house and the eerie note he left. The house was too silent, every creak a threat. Then a knock at the front door echoed through the otherwise silent house. It was sharp, insistent, cutting through the dark. My body froze up. The silence of the house was now deafening as I listened in fear. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. After a few seconds, they knocked again. My heart started beating faster. I reached for my phone. I got my phone and called 911. The operator's voice was a lifeline, steady against my panic. They sent officers right away. But the knocks continued the whole time I waited. They were rhythmic, unhurried, a taunt, eerily. They never got louder or more rushed or aggressive. It was just the same knocking over and over, going through the hallways of my home. Each sound was a step closer to something I couldn't face. The operator on the phone updated me that the cops were 2 minutes out, and just after that, there was a longer pause between the knocking. The silence was worse, heavy with dread. 15 seconds, then 30, then a whole minute passed. He was gone. When the officers showed up, nobody was at the door. They were too late. The porch was empty. The note my only evidence. Again, I told them what happened, and they seemed to take it a little bit more seriously this time. But it still wasn't enough for them to do anything about it. They promised patrols, but it felt like a gesture. They said they would have an officer patrol around here for the next couple weeks. I nodded, but the fear stayed. Those weeks came and went, and the man never came back up to my door or to the end of the driveway. At least from what I know, the house isn't home anymore. I found a small, folded cloth in my mailbox days later. Not mine, with a faint, chemical smell. It wasn't proof, but it was enough to keep me awake. I installed cameras, changed the locks, but the note's words, "Pat, answer the door," echo in my mind. The neighborhood feels different now. Its quiet streets hiding eyes I can't see. I don't know who he was, what he wanted, or if he's truly gone. But I know I'll never open that door again. The woman on the trail. The woods were quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that feels like it's holding its breath. My boots crunched on the dirt trail, the only sound in the morning air, until I saw it. A car, parked where no car should be, its engine off, its driver watching me from the shadows. I was just a kid, barely navigating high school, living in a house tucked deep in the forest. The trail was my path to the world, a ribbon of earth connecting home to school. But that morning, it felt different, like the trees themselves were leaning in, waiting for something to break. The woman in the car, didn't move. Her eyes locked on me as I approached. Her face was pale, her hair a tangled mess, and something about her gaze made my skin crawl. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding, but I could feel her stare, heavy as a hand on my shoulder. This wasn't a lost traveler. This was someone who knew exactly where she was, who knew me, and who wasn't here by chance. The trail was mine, but she was claiming it, and I was about to learn why. I didn't know it yet, but the woman on the trail was a ghost from my family's past, and her eyes held secrets I was never meant to uncover. The woods weren't safe anymore, and neither was I. My home was out in the woods. The town was small, its houses scattered among trees, far from the crowded cities I'd seen on TV. It was very woodsy all around, and the buildings and houses weren't so compacted together. Our place sat on a chunk of land my dad and grandpa built from scratch. My parents had a decent amount of land, and my dad had built the place with his dad. It didn't have a real road or a driveway. It was more of a dirt trail, so the school buses didn't have a stop at our place. I had to walk a mile to a friend's house for the bus or trek the whole way to school. Usually I just walk all the way to school. The trail was familiar, its curves and ruts second nature, but it was ours. Private, leading only to our door. That morning, the air was crisp, birdsong weaving through the pines. I slung my backpack over my shoulder, my breath visible in the chill, and started down the path. The woods were alive, but peaceful, until I rounded a bend and froze. I was walking down the trail from my home, enjoying the calm morning sounds of the woods, when I spotted a car up ahead. It wasn't my parents' car or anyone else's that I knew, and it was just parked right on the trail. The car was old, its paint chipped, sitting like it belonged there. This trail only led to and from the house, so someone being on here was unusual. I'd never seen a stranger here before. I don't know if I'd ever seen a random car here at all before this. I felt kind of uncomfortable having to pass it. My stomach knotted as I approached, my eyes catching movement inside. There was a woman inside. She looked 35 or 40, with dark circles under her eyes and shaggy black hair. Her face was gaunt, her gaze sharp. She glanced at me, but I just looked down. I hurried past, my boots kicking up dust. I could feel her eyes on me as I walked past, though. I didn't look back, my pace quickening until the trail curved and the car was out of sight. My heart thudded, my mind racing with questions. Who was she? Why was she here? The woods felt smaller now, the trees less friendly, their branches closing in. At the dinner table that night, I mentioned it to my parents, asking who it was and why they were there. Their faces changed, a flicker of worry passing between them. Both of them looked worried and confused. They told me the woman must have just gotten lost, and I shouldn't worry about it. But their eyes betrayed them, tense and guarded. They dropped me off at school for the next week, which was odd because they both started work early. The drop-offs were a hassle, their early shifts making it a sacrifice. They must have called in late for the entire week just to drop me off. I thought they were overreacting. I was old enough to handle a walk. Honestly, I thought that it was an overreaction, as I felt I was old enough to handle myself. But I knew my parents were just being safe. Still, their worry stuck with me, a seed of doubt growing in my chest. When I started walking again, I was cautious, but not afraid. The car hadn't reappeared during the drop-off week, and I'd half convinced myself it was nothing. But the trail had other plans. I packed up my book bag and started walking. During the last week that I'd been dropped off, we never saw the woman or the car. I felt safe, the morning bright, the woods welcoming, until I reached that spot. This time when I got to that same spot in the woods, she was there again, sitting in her car, watching me. My breath caught, my body tensing. I had a mini heart attack. This was too much to be a coincidence. Twice now, in the same place, only when I was alone. Showing up twice on the trail that was basically our driveway, sitting in the same spot, and only showing up when I was walking alone. I stood frozen, her eyes boring into me through the windshield. I couldn't pass her again. Not like this. I made the decision to cut through the woods instead of walking past her again. I stepped off the trail, branches snapping underfoot, hoping to lose her in the trees. I took a few steps off the trail, but immediately the woman noticed. She turned her car on and drove up closer to me. The engine's rumble sent my pulse racing. I pretended to ignore her, walking faster into the woods. The trees closed around me, but I heard it. The creak of a car door opening, the crunch of leaves. I heard her car door open and her footsteps crunching on the leaves behind me. My heart pounded, fear clawing at my throat. I kept moving, weaving through the underbrush, when her voice cut through the air, soft and chilling. She called out my name like my full name in this eerily calm and loving voice. I stopped, my blood cold, and turned. I turned my head and looked at her. She had this dead stare and blank, expressionless face. Her eyes were sunken, her skin sallow, like she hadn't slept in years. Her eyes were tired and heavy, and she had this sickly look. I ran, branches tearing at my clothes, my backpack bouncing wildly. I sprinted away, and after losing sight of her, I circled back through the woods to my house where I called my parents. My hands shook as I dialed, my voice trembling as I told them everything. They called the police and came home right away. They sat me down, their faces grim, and told me the truth. What I didn't expect was my parents to know exactly who the woman was. It was my dad's ex-wife, from almost 2 decades ago. She'd been part of their lives before I was born, a shadow from a past they'd buried. Apparently, she'd had mental health issues for a while, and would have these horrifying episodes where she'd get obsessed with something and do disturbing things. The day I told them I saw her, my parents reported it to the police, knowing it had to be her. They'd suspected her immediately, her history too dark to ignore. Police failed to do anything about it, though, only checking up on her and saying she seemed normal. But she wasn't. For that whole week, though, she had been stalking our house, knowing that every time my parents left for work early, she'd timed it, waiting for me to walk alone. Her car a trap on our trail. My parents didn't tell me what happened to her after, or why she'd chosen me. My parents never told me what happened to her after this, or what she was trying to do to me, or why she was doing any of it. The woods, once my sanctuary, became a place of dread. Every rustle a reminder of her eyes, her voice calling my name. I don't walk the trail alone anymore. The trees still stand, the dirt still stretches, but they're hers now, claimed by the woman who knew too much and said too little. Her shadow lingers, a secret my parents won't share, a fear I'll carry forever. The shadow in the closet. You're alone in your apartment. The night heavy with silence. The curtains sway slightly, and you freeze. A faint light flickers outside your window, too deliberate to be a car. You pull the blanket tighter, heart quickening. The light vanishes, but the air feels wrong, like someone's watching from just beyond the glass. You tell yourself it's nothing, just the neighbor's headlights. but your bedroom door creaks, barely open, a sliver of darkness peeking through. You always lock it. You sit up, breath shallow, straining to hear. A soft rustle comes from the closet, faint but unmistakable. Something's in your room, and it's not leaving. You reach for your phone, but your eyes catch a glint, an eye staring back from the closet's crack. Cold, unblinking. Your home is no longer yours. I worked at a grocery store, usually closing shifts, and I lived alone in a small one-bedroom apartment. The job was routine: scan items, smile at customers, clean up, go home. We had a lot of regulars at our store, customers that would come in all the time, and usually around the same time as well. One of these customers was a guy that came in right before closing a couple times a week. Nobody knew his name, but everybody knew of him because nobody liked customers that came in 10 minutes before the store closed. He was tall, gaunt, with shadows under his eyes that made him look like he hadn't slept in days. Usually, being the only cashier, I'd be the one interacting with him. He was always a bit strange. He didn't talk much and always had a tired look on his face. His purchases were mundane: milk, bread, sometimes a candy bar, but his presence lingered, heavy, like a storm cloud. This night, he came in as he always did right before closing, grabbing a couple things and coming up to the register. I scanned everything. He paid and he left. We didn't exchange any words aside from a simple greeting. I finished my tasks, locked the register, and left, the parking lot quiet under the streetlights. As I walked out to my car, I noticed the man was still in the parking lot. He was standing awkwardly outside of his car, with his hands at his side, just looking at the store. His silhouette was unnerving, motionless, like he was waiting for something, or someone. I got in my car and went home. I shook it off, telling myself he was just a weird guy, nothing more. At home, I unwound. The apartment's familiar hum, a comfort. I didn't get into bed until late, only moments after getting under the covers. Though, a bright light glared into my bedroom through one of the windows. I thought it was a neighbor pulling in, so I didn't really care about it. After a second, the light shut off, which unconsciously confirmed to me that it was just headlights. I drifted off, the day's exhaustion pulling me under. But sleep didn't last. I woke up in the night to what I thought was my phone ringing. The way I woke up, half asleep and in the middle of a dream. It was hard to tell what was real and what wasn't. I rubbed my eyes and tapped my phone on the nightstand. It was blank. No messages or phone calls came in. I wasn't sure what to think. I was going to just ignore it and go back to sleep, as I wasn't even fully awake yet to begin with. But the slightest thing caught my eye as I rolled back over. The bedroom door was barely cracked open, not even enough to let any light in or anything. It was just uneven with the door frame, not latched shut. I always closed the door to my room. So, seeing it not fully shut immediately woke me up. I got out of bed and walked over, pushing it closed to see if maybe it was stuck for some reason. It smoothly latched into the door frame, just like it always did. So, there was no way I'd mistakenly left it open. I felt my body get shaky. My heart was pounding. But even with everything pointing otherwise, I still tried to convince myself that this was somehow nothing. I tried to think of any possible way that this was something to not worry about. But my mind thought back to the light I saw before falling asleep. Panic crept in, cold and sharp. I walked over to the window and peeked through the blinds. There was a car parked in my driveway. I could only see the back half of it, but I instantly felt a rush of panic. Who was in my house? I hurried over to the door again and flicked on the lights. I stood there by the door, panicking and thinking, realizing I should call 911 just to be safe. I looked at the nightstand that my phone was on, and just before I started to walk over there, I saw an eye looking back at me from a crack in the closet. My body shook. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. I spun around and sprinted out of my house. My bare feet hit the cold pavement, my lungs burning as I ran to a neighbor's door, pounding until they answered. By the time I found a neighbor that would answer their door and call the police for me, several minutes had gone by already. The car in my driveway was still there when officers showed up, but the man was gone. It didn't take long for them to use the car to track him down, though, and I felt nauseous when it turned out to be the man from the grocery store. His reasonings for everything didn't make any sense, but it was clear he'd had his eye on me for a while now, and he was not mentally well. I think the only reason I'd woken up that night was because the man's phone rang while he was hiding, and he silenced it just as I woke up. If not for that, I don't know what would have happened to me or if I'd even be here right now. The police said he'd been watching me for weeks, memorizing my shifts, my route home. His car matched the one in the parking lot, the one in my driveway. He'd stood there, night after night, learning my life. The apartment, once my sanctuary, felt like a trap. I moved out soon after, unable to sleep in that room, unable to close my eyes without seeing that glint in the closet. Every creak, every shadow, became him. The grocery store job ended too. I couldn't face the register, couldn't scan items without wondering who was watching. I'd catch myself checking parking lots, expecting his car to be there, idling in the dark. The police said he was unstable, his motives unclear, but that didn't ease the fear. What if he'd been in my home before, slipping in while I slept? I got a new phone number, changed my routines, but the violation lingered. Some nights, I still wake, certain I hear a phone ring, certain an eye is watching from the dark, waiting for me to look back. The Polaroid stalker. The snow fell in thick curtains, swallowing the world outside the bowling alley's grimy windows. I worked at a run-down, family-owned joint in our small town, the kind of place that smelled of stale beer and old shoes. It wasn't much, but it was open 24/7, a beacon for restless locals with nowhere else to go. I work at a really trashy bowling alley in my small town. It's one of those family-owned type places. I drew the short straw for the 10 to 6 shift, the deadest hours, especially on a night like this. I had the dreaded 10 to 6 shift. It was almost always dead, and this night, it was even more so. The town was locked in a snowstorm, the kind that buried cars and silenced streets. There was a huge snowstorm rolling through our town. No one was coming. I clocked in, relieving the last shift, and found the place empty. From the time I clocked in and took over for the last shift, not a single customer was there. I busied myself cleaning, wiping down lanes, polishing balls, anything to kill time. I spent 2 hours cleaning up all the lanes, except for one, just in case a group happened to come in later. I peered out the windows. The parking lot, a white void. Snow piling high. I checked out the windows. The parking lot was empty, and snow was stacking up. No one could drive through without a plow. I wasn't sure someone could even drive through the parking lot with all this snow unless a plow truck came through. The place felt like a tomb, its neon signs buzzing faintly in the quiet. I let my guard down. With no cameras or supervisors, the bowling alley was a haven for slacking off. The place didn't have cameras, let alone anyone to watch them. So taking long breaks on slow days, or even sometimes sleeping, was easy to get away with. I dragged a chair to the window, sinking into it, watching the snow swirl under the streetlights. After a bit, I pulled up a chair to the window and sat down. just looking out and resting, as there was nothing else to do. My eyes grew heavy, the monotony lulling me into a daze. Another hour or so went by. The storm was my only company, until it wasn't. Something broke the silence. A sharp sound, like a heavy object hitting the floor, echoed from behind the lanes. When seemingly out of nowhere, there was a loud thud from behind the bowling lanes. I snapped awake, my heart kicking against my ribs. I think I was half asleep when it happened, but I jolted up. I stood, chair scraping, and moved toward the back room, my steps hesitant. I got off the chair and walked toward the back room. What could have caused it? A pipe? The storm? I really had no clue what that was. Maybe it had something to do with the snowstorm outside. The back room was where the machinery lived. Pins, balls, and the clanking guts of the lanes. The back room was where all the pins and bowling balls were stored, along with all the machines that run everything. I wasn't alone. The door creaked open, revealing a long, dark hallway stretching the length of the building. It's basically a long hallway going the full length of the building. I flicked on my flashlight, the beam trembling in my hand. When I opened the door, it was completely dark. At first, there was nothing, just shadows and the hum of old equipment. I didn't hear or see anything at first until I looked down. Then I saw it, wet footprints, clear as day, trailing down the hall. There was water going down the hallway in a very clear footstep pattern. My breath caught, my face draining of color. My face went pale. "Hello, who's in here?" I called, my voice shaking. "Hello? Who's in here?" I stepped forward, calling again, my flashlight sweeping the walls. I started walking down, calling out a couple more times. Then I froze. Taped to the wall was an envelope, its edges curling in the damp air. Before I came across something taped to the wall, it was an envelope. My hands trembled as I opened it, pulling out a stack of Polaroids. In it were pictures, like Polaroids, of me working alone that night. They showed me cleaning lanes, walking the counter, oblivious. There were some of me cleaning the lanes and just walking around. One was different, taken from just behind me as I sat by the window, so close I could have felt their breath. And one was disturbingly close to me as I was sitting by the window. It looked like they must have only been a few feet behind me. My knees buckled, the world spinning. I felt like I was going to faint. I ran. I ran back out the way I came and right to the front desk, dialing 911. My fingers fumbled with the phone, my voice barely steady as I spoke to the dispatcher. I tried waiting for a minute, but the silence of the building, the unknowingness of what was going on, just started to build up anxiety in me. The alley's silence was suffocating, every creak a threat. I ended up running out to my car and waiting in there. I locked the doors, snow piling around me, my breath fogging the windows. Despite the weather, police actually got there really quick, like in 2 or 3 minutes. They searched the building, the lot, but found nothing. No footprints, no envelope, no one. Whoever had been stalking me that night left no traces. The alley's lack of cameras was a curse. Of course, the trashy place didn't have any cameras, so there was nothing else to go on. I stayed in my car until the police left, their flashlights fading into the storm. I don't know what that person was trying to do, or if it was just some sick joke or what. Was it a prank? A warning? Something worse? Since then, I didn't have anything else happen. I kept working, but the alley felt different, its corners darker, its silence heavier. I quit a couple months after. Though, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the memory of those Polaroids burning in my mind. Some nights, when snow falls, I see that envelope again, taped to a wall I can't escape, and wonder who was standing just behind me. The hitchhiker's trap. The farmland stretched endlessly, a sea of shadows under a starless sky, the road slicing through it like a forgotten scar. I was driving back from my friend's remote house, an hour from home, exhaustion pulling at my eyelids. I was driving alone from my friend's place all the way back home. Music blared to keep me awake. The empty asphalt ahead my only focus. I had some music playing to keep myself awake, and I just stared at the empty road ahead. Then, my headlights caught something unnatural. A suitcase, upright, dead center in the lane. My headlights lit up something right in the middle of the road. I slowed, heart lurching, the absurdity of it jarring me awake. It was a suitcase, like a full, unopened suitcase, just standing up in the middle of the road. I stared. Too long. The suitcase a silent sentinel in the night. I probably stared at it for an odd amount of time because I was so tired and caught off guard by it. It had to have fallen from a truck, landing perfectly. Nothing else made sense. It was definitely odd that it was standing upright like that. But it had to have just fallen out of someone's truck and having to land like that. Too tired to investigate. I swerved into the oncoming lane, bypassing it. I decided to just go into the oncoming lane and go around it. The oddity lingered in my mind, but faded fast. I kept driving, thinking about it for a little bit, but ultimately forgetting about it pretty quickly. Then, minutes later, my high beams lit up another obstacle, a truck, parked in my lane, dark and lifeless. Something came up in my headlights. This time, it was a truck parked in the middle of the lane. No lights, no blinkers, just a hulking shadow blocking my path. None of its lights or blinkers were on. I stopped, honking, waiting for movement that never came. I stopped behind them and waited for a second, then honked a few times. The truck didn't move at all, creeping around it. I saw dents and scrapes, old or new. I couldn't tell. As I did, I noticed it had a few large dents and scrapes on the side. More unsettling, the cab was empty. No driver, no silhouette. I didn't see anyone inside the truck. It was still dark looking through the windows, but I didn't see any shape or outline of anyone sitting in either the front or the back. I pulled ahead, glancing around. Nothing but fields. No reason for this abandonment. I pulled further up and in front of it, getting back onto my side of the road, then slowed even more to look around. It was still just farmland in all directions. A chill settled in, the silence louder than my music. I felt strange about it, kind of creeped out. Honestly. I drove on, senses sharpened, the suitcase and truck nagging at my thoughts. Was the suitcase and the truck somehow connected, or were they both just conveniently in the middle of the road? Then, a figure appeared, waving frantically in my lane. There was a person in the road. He was standing in my lane and waving his arms at me to stop. Early 40s, disheveled, with messy hair and scraped arms. He approached with a strained smile. He looked early 40s and pretty disheveled. Messy hair, cuts and scrapes on his hands and arms, and overall, just not in good shape. "Did you see a truck back there?" he asked. "Hey, did you see a truck not too far back that way?" I said. "Yes, I did." I nodded, unease growing as he asked for a ride. "Think you could give me a lift back there?" His story faltered. Something about running out of gas, walking to a station. The man stumbled over his words for a second, before settling on saying he ran out of gas and was trying to walk to a gas station. But why return to an empty truck? But then, why would I drive him back to the truck? Wouldn't he have asked me to drive him to the gas station? His words rushed, deflecting my questions. He kept talking, though, like he wasn't letting me think too hard about it. As I fumbled for an excuse, my gaze drifted past him. A car's tail end, buried in the crops, its headlight glinting faintly. My eyes wandered behind him and happened to see something sticking out of the crops on the side of the road. It looked like the tail end of a small car. Panic surged. This was no coincidence. I didn't know what the hell was going on, but I knew whatever it was wasn't good. I rolled up my window, his smile twisting into a scowl. I rolled the window up and the man instantly went from smiling to frowning. He pounded the glass, shouting, eyes wild. His eyes widened, and he started yelling and hitting the window. I floored it, heart racing, and called the police. I pulled away and sped down the road. I got my phone out quickly after and called the cops. They found the car, its driver dead, not from a crash, but murder. The car I saw in the crops was still there, and I guess the scene was far worse than I imagined. That was someone else's car, and the driver in it was no longer alive, not from a crash. Though, the hitchhiker, likely the killer, had used the suitcase and truck as bait. It seemed they likely picked up a hitchhiker, the guy I saw. It's assumed that the suitcase and the truck in the road had something to do with getting the car to pull over and pick him up. The truck was gone, his tracks covered, leaving only questions. Reportedly, the truck was gone when they got there. Locals later spoke of similar traps, objects in roads, stranded vehicles, luring drivers to stop. The area had a history of transient crime, unsolved cases dotting its past. I scoured old news, finding stories of missing travelers, their cars found in fields. That night changed me. I avoid rural roads now. The dark no longer just empty. His face, that fleeting smile, haunts my dreams, a reminder of how close I came. I drive with my doors locked, my phone ready, knowing the next suitcase might not be an accident. The farmland's quiet hides predators, and I'll never trust it again. The trap on Pinewood Drive. At 16, I thought I knew the world. Pizza deliveries, back roads, the hum of my cheap car. But some roads lead to places you don't come back from, and some deliveries aren't what they seem. My name is Danny, and this is the story of the night I drove into a trap, where the pizzas were bait, and I was the prey. The neighborhood was quiet, too quiet, its houses swallowed by woods that seemed to watch. I didn't see the danger, not at first, not until the headlights followed me, not until the driveway became a cage. 4 men, faces hidden, hands ready. They wanted me, and they weren't letting go. I escaped, but my car didn't, and the truth of that night still haunts me. I was never meant to leave. I was 16. I had just gotten a job at a pizza place about 6 months ago, and during that time, I saved up enough to buy a cheap car. It was a beat-up sedan, but to me it was freedom, a ticket out of the shop's greasy chaos. I hated not being able to drive myself, but also I wanted to do deliveries instead of working inside the shop. The open road, the radio, the tips. It was my escape, my pride. It was a regular weeknight. I got in after school at 5 and was scheduled until 10:30. It was busy for the first couple hours, but by 8, it abruptly slowed down. There wasn't another delivery to be made until 9 o'clock. The shop was quiet, the hum of the oven my only company, until the printer spit out an order. It was an online order for just 2 medium pizzas. I picked it up and started driving. The night was clear, the streets empty, my headlights cutting through the dark like a promise. It wasn't busy out, just a few cars here and there. But once I got about 5 minutes out from the neighborhood, a car pulled onto the road from a side street and came up behind me. Its lights were too bright, too close, a shadow in my rearview mirror. The roads were empty, and they could have easily passed me if they wanted to, but they stayed right behind me. I turned up the radio, trying to drown out the unease creeping in. I didn't really think about it. I mean, to be honest, I didn't care at all at the time. Throughout the next minutes, they stayed right behind me. 5 minutes became a lifetime, their presence a weight I couldn't shake. I told myself it was nothing, just another driver. But my hands tightened on the wheel. When I took the turn into the neighborhood, I looked in my mirror. After a few seconds, their headlights appeared, turning down the road. The coincidence stung. Sharp and cold. That's a pretty big coincidence. What were the chances that the only other car on the road was going to the same small neighborhood as me? I guess it was very possible, but it got me feeling a little more aware of the situation. The neighborhood was a maze of trees, houses scattered like afterthoughts. I kept driving. This street was through the woods with individual houses spread out on either side of the road. Some were right up on the road, and some were down longer driveways. The road narrowed, the woods closing in, my headlights the only light. As I got deeper into the neighborhood, finally, my headlights lit up a mailbox that had the right address on it. I turned into the driveway. The driveway was a tunnel of gravel, pines looming on either side. I checked my mirrors again, and a few seconds later, the car passed right by and continued down the road. Relief washed over me, my breath easing. I remember feeling relieved and silly for thinking anything of it. I laughed at myself, shaking my head. I drove to the end of the driveway. It wasn't too long, maybe like 200 feet or something. I pulled up and got out with the pizzas. The house was dark, its porch light a lonely beacon. I gave the door a couple knocks. Nobody answered the door for a minute. And while the porch light was on, it didn't look like any of the inside lights were on. The silence was heavy. The house too still. I shifted the pizzas, my unease returning. Sharper now, I knocked again. About 30 seconds passed. Then a light shined through the window, and a few seconds later, a woman answered the door. She looked like she was in her early 30s and was wearing a nightgown, and she looked really tired. Her eyes were hollow, her face drawn, like she'd been woken from a bad dream. Immediately, something about this felt wrong. I had these pizzas ordered to this address. I then read out the address to her, but she looked annoyed. Her frown deepened, her voice sharp with irritation. The woman said she didn't order anything and was trying to sleep. She was definitely a little cranky, but it was clear there was some kind of mistake. I stammered an apology, my mind racing. I apologized and walked off the porch. I was kind of spaced out for a moment, looking at the ground, thinking about how weird this was. The gravel crunched under my feet, each step louder in the quiet, as I walked back to my car. But about halfway there, I looked up and felt a chill rush through me. There was a car sitting right behind mine. It was the same one that I thought was following me. Its headlights were off, but the exhaust fogged the air. The engine still alive. Its headlights were off, but I could see the fog coming from the exhaust, so the car was still on. I felt really uncomfortable. My heart kicked up, my breath catching. Did they also live here with the woman and were just pulling in? Or did it have something to do with the order? Everything just felt really off, like too coincidental. The pieces didn't fit. The night too staged. I forced my legs to move. My eyes locked on my car. I knew something was wrong. I continued walking to my car, hoping they would see me and either say something or move. Every step was a gamble, my pulse a drumbeat. I got in and tossed the pizzas on the passenger seat and turned my car on. But they stayed there. The key turned. The engine roared, but the car didn't budge. The driveway was thin. There wasn't really any space to go around them. But I pulled further up toward the house and turned around. I maneuvered, desperate, the house looming like a silent witness. Surely, they would see that I was trying to leave now. They still remained right in the middle of the driveway, blocking the exit. Their car was a wall, unyielding, deliberate. There was about 30 seconds as I faced their car, and they faced me, and we both just sat there. The silence was a scream, the moment stretching into eternity. During that time, I kind of put everything together. Them driving behind me, following me into the neighborhood, and the creepy sudden appearance of them blocking the driveway. None of this was a coincidence. The truth hit like a fist. This was a trap. I felt my body start to go numb as my heart started pumping in my chest. I didn't know what to do. My hands shook, my mind blank with panic. Then their car doors opened. 4 men got out. They all had hoodies and hats on, covering pretty much their whole faces. One of them had their hand suspiciously tucked into his hoodie pocket like he was holding on to something. Their shadows moved fast, purposeful, their faces hidden, but their intent clear. I was prey, and they were hunters. They started running up to my car, and I panicked. I hit the gas, trying to go around them and past their car, but there wasn't enough room. The driveway was too narrow, the trees too close. The wheels went off the driveway, and I skidded in the dirt, ramming into a tree. It was a pretty slow hit. The airbags didn't even go off or anything, and I don't think the car was stuck. But I didn't take any chances. The jolt was enough. The tree a warning. I jumped out and started running. I heard one of them chasing me and yelling to the others, but they turned back after a little bit. My lungs burned, branches clawing at me as I plunged into the woods. When I was safe, I stayed in the woods and called 911. When the officers got to the home, all of the men and both cars were gone. My car was never recovered, even to this day. The house was empty, the woman gone, the pizzas left on the ground. I was alone, but I was alive. What essentially happened was the group used some random address to lure me in by ordering a pizza, hoping to trap me in. What they were going to do with me is unknown. The fact that one of them chased me makes me think they didn't plan on letting me go. I got lucky that night. The police found nothing. No car, no men, no answers. The order was a ghost, placed online, untraceable. I quit the pizza job, sold the dream of driving for something safer. But the road still calls me in my nightmares. The woman's tired eyes, the car's silent menace, the men's hidden faces. They're with me, a reminder that some deliveries aren't about pizza. I check my mirrors now, lock my doors, because I know, out there, in the quiet places, traps are set, and not everyone gets away. The blizzard's trap, snow falls, soft but relentless, cloaking the world in silence. You're driving home, the road's empty, your truck's heater humming. A red light stops you at a deserted intersection, the night pressing in. A knock shatters the quiet. A woman stands at your window, pale and shivering. Her story simple. A broken car, a freezing walk, a plea for a ride. She seems harmless, desperate. You let her in. She guides you to a neighborhood you've never entered, its houses crumbling, The streets unplowed. The snow deepens. Your truck struggles. And her requests grow insistent, pulling you deeper into the dark. Something's wrong. Her smile falters. Her words sharpen. You stop, refusing to go further. She leaves, angry, but your headlights catch a glimpse of shadows, figures waiting where she wanted you to go. You floor it, heart racing, the snow swallowing their forms. This wasn't a rescue. It was a lure, and you were the prey. The night hides their intent, but you know you barely escaped. I was driving home from work. It was snowing out. The flakes were light, dusting the road, but enough to make me cautious. Nothing crazy, but enough to be driving slower and more carefully. The cold was brutal, the kind that seeps through glass and steel. It was also pretty cold out. Freezing temperatures for sure. The world was still. The streets abandoned. My truck the only sign of life. The roads were quiet and deserted. I eased to a stop at an intersection, the red light glowing in the haze. Along my route, I pulled up to an intersection. It was a red light. Although no other cars were anywhere to be seen, I sat, my mind on the warm bed, waiting at home. I waited, thinking about how much I wanted to sleep when I get home. Then, a sharp rap against my passenger window jolted me, when all of a sudden, there was a knock against my truck. My heart lurched, my eyes snapping to the glass. I darted my eyes to the passenger window. It was a woman. She stood there, her face pale, her breath clouding in the cold. I had no idea where she came from, but she was knocking on my window and looking right at me. I hesitated, then lowered the window. I rolled it down. She looked young, maybe in her late 20s, and her face looked cold and pale. Her eyes were wide, her lips chapped from the wind. She apologized and said she really didn't want to bother anyone. But her car broke down a mile back, and she tried to walk home, only to find out how freezing cold it was. Her voice was soft, almost fragile, tugging at my sympathy. She wanted a ride, saying it was only another mile down this road. I glanced at the empty road, then back at her, feeling bad for her. I let her in. She climbed in, her thin jacket no match for the cold. Maybe it was because of the way she said everything, or just because she looked like an innocent woman. But I believed her story, and it was freezing outside, and she did look cold. I started driving as she repeatedly thanked me. Her gratitude felt genuine, her voice warming with every word. But as we drove, the snow thickened, the road narrowing. A couple minutes later, she told me to turn down into a neighborhood. I knew this stretch from my daily commute, but I'd never ventured off the main road. Now, I did pass by this place every day on my commute to work, but I'd never actually been through any of these neighborhoods or knew anything about them. The turn revealed a grim scene. Tiny houses, barely standing, their windows dark and sagging. Turning in, though, it was clear this wasn't a nice place. The houses were extremely small, old, and outdated, looking almost like trailer homes lined up next to each other. The snow was deeper here, unplowed, clinging to my tires. I only got a bit down the road before my truck started having trouble. The street ahead looked worse, a white void swallowing the path. The street wasn't plowed yet, and it looked even worse further down. I slowed, my gut tightening. As we got deeper into the back of the neighborhood, I slowed to a stop and asked if this was an okay spot for her to get out. I turned to her, expecting relief. When I looked at her, though, her face was frowned until she noticed me looking. Her expression shifted, a forced smile curling her lips. She smiled and politely asked if I could go a little bit further. I paused, the truck idling. I hesitated to answer. Something in her tone felt off, less desperate, more demanding. She asked again, a little less nicely. I glanced at the road, then back at her. I explained to her that I didn't want to risk getting my truck stuck down there. The snow was too deep, the risk too high. But she still insisted, trying to guilt-trip me. Her words turned sharp, accusing me of leaving her stranded. Finally, I just said no and told her to get out. Her eyes flashed with anger, her jaw tight. She looked angry, but opened the door and got out. She slammed the door, the sound echoing in the quiet. I thought that was really strange, considering how I went out of my way to help her. I shifted into gear, ready to leave, but the air felt heavier, the night too still. My instincts screamed that this wasn't over. I started to do a 3-point turn. As I swung the truck around, my headlights swept across the houses, cutting through the snow. And when my headlights shined into the side facing the houses, I saw something. Shapes, human shapes, standing near the tree line, just beyond the road's end. People standing further back near the tree line, which was also where the woman was toward. They were still, watching, exactly where she'd urged me to drive. They were just a little bit down the road, right where the woman was trying to get me to go. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a coincidence. She wasn't alone, and I wasn't safe. I hurried up and got out of there. The truck groaned through the snow, tires spinning as I pushed it back to the main road. I don't know what kind of situation I got myself into that night, but I think it was really close to getting a lot worse. My heart pounded as I drove, the figures fading into the storm. Had I gotten stuck out there, or even just driven a bit further up? Who knows what they would have done? Were they waiting to rob me, hurt me, or worse? The woman's face haunted me, her smile, her insistence, a mask hiding something sinister. I didn't stop until I reached home, locking the doors behind me. The snow kept falling, burying the night's secrets. I never drove through that neighborhood again, sticking to main roads, avoiding the dark corners of my commute. But the memory lingers, the woman's pale face, the figures in the shadows, the trap I narrowly escaped. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I feel their eyes sometimes, watching from the storm, waiting for another chance. And I wonder how many others drove that road, saw her face, and weren't as lucky as me. The eyes in the snow. I'm 32 and work for a trucking company. The road is my life, mile after mile of asphalt and silence. But that night, the silence turned predatory. The roads weren't too bad for the most part, but driving in winter was always a little bit more tiring. Snow fell lightly, a veil over the world, hiding something or someone in its folds. His eyes, wide and unblinking, stared through my window, and I knew I wasn't alone anymore. Whoever he was, he followed me for hours, and I still don't know why. I pulled into a small truck stop on the side of the road, just to use the bathroom and grab a coffee, and maybe rest my eyes for a little bit. The place was a flicker of neon in the dark, a lonely outpost on a forgotten stretch of highway. I parked and went into the building, then came back out with my coffee and hopped back into the driver's seat. The cab was my fortress, the coffee a lifeline against the cold. I took a moment to myself and just sat there, taking a few sips and looking around. The lot was nearly empty, the world holding its breath. Only a couple other trucks were in the parking lot. Guess it was a quiet night. Then I saw him. As I sat there, I happened to spot someone at the back of the building. He was a shadow against the wall, barely lit by the dim glow of a flickering bulb. The lights were dim back there, but some guy was leaning against the wall and looking out in my direction. His stare was heavy, fixed, as if he could see through the dark. I couldn't see his eyes, but my truck was the only one parked over here. There was nothing else to look at. I told myself it was nothing, just a weary traveler like me. I minded my own business and just kept sipping my coffee. But every time I looked back, the guy was still looking over here. I couldn't stay. I was sure it was nothing, but it still felt too weird for me to get any shut-eye. His gaze was a weight, pressing against my instincts. Snow was starting to come down as well. The flakes danced in my headlights, a warning to move. I put my drink in the cup holder and started up the truck, then pulled out and began the next section of the drive. The engine's rumble was a comfort, the road a promise of escape. The coffee definitely kicked in, keeping my eyes open. The roads were completely empty, or so I thought. Something followed. About 30-ish minutes down the road, a light glimmered in my side mirror for just a moment, like a glint reflecting off of something behind my trailer. It was faint, fleeting, but wrong. I kept checking my mirrors, thinking it was a car coming up, but there was nothing behind me that I could see. The highway stretched dark and silent, the snow thickening. Maybe it was a broken reflector on the road or something. I didn't know, but my gut churned. A quiet alarm. The snow was beginning to pile up a bit on the road, so for the next while, I was more focused on what was ahead of me, making sure I made it in one piece. He was closer than I thought. I think a good hour or so went by. Focusing on the road was getting more exhausting with every minute. But then again, there was a quick glint in my side mirror. This time, I caught it. I only barely shifted my eyes quick enough to catch what it was. There was a car right behind my trailer, like so close that it was completely covered in my mirrors. It was a ghost, invisible in the dark. Its headlights were off, too. So only when it was slightly off to the side did my headlights reflect onto theirs, creating that little glint I was seeing. No one drives like that. Not in a snowstorm. Not that close. I was no stranger to having people tailgating me for going slow. But this was really strange. Though, in this weather, being that close to me and with no headlights, what did he want? What were they doing? After a minute or two of thinking about it, I thought it best to get away from them, or at least keep them off my tail for both of our safety. I gripped the wheel, my knuckles white. I merged into the other lane, but the car followed. It mirrored me, relentless, confused. I merged back into the right lane. This time, I think they got the hint that I was onto them, and they stayed on their side. I held my breath, watching. They started to slow down, though, and eventually they fell out of sight. The road was empty again, but the relief was hollow. I didn't have a clue what they were doing, but at least they were off my back. I needed rest. I decided to pull off at a rest stop to get a few hours of shut-eye. The stop was a desolate patch of pavement, barely a refuge. It was just one of those little cutaways off the road that could fit maybe 2 or 3 semis. There was no building or restrooms. It was just a parking area. The snow fell heavier now, blanketing the world. I parked, cut off the engine, leaned my chair all the way back, and closed my eyes. The cab was dark, the wind a soft lullaby. I dozed off pretty fast. I was used to being limited on sleep, so every minute counts. Sleep came, a fragile escape. The calm winds and snow trickling down definitely helped. Though, he found me. I slowly opened my eyes, seeing the dark truck cabin and the faint highway lights in front of me. Something was wrong. A prickle at the edge of my senses. I was still really tired. I didn't know why I woke up. The cab was too quiet, the snow too loud. After a second, I rolled my body over to reposition myself, but was instantly met with the eyes of something outside my window. They were wide, unblinking, boring into me like a predator's. They were staring in at me with disturbingly wide, creepy eyes. My heart stopped, my body rigid. I almost fell out of my seat, but the guy didn't even flinch. He wanted in. He just stepped down and tried to open the door. The handle rattled, a violation of my sanctuary. But after a few tries, I heard his footsteps rushing away in the snow. The crunch faded, swallowed by the storm. I used the radio to call for help, and moments later, a car drove out from behind my truck. Its engine roared, a ghost fleeing into the night. It was the same one that was on the road before. I knew it was him, the man from the truck stop. I gave as much of a description as I could, and it was as the officers asked me to go over everything that happened that night that I remembered the man I saw watching me at the truck stop. His shadow had followed me, mile after mile. Maybe it was him this whole time. But why was he stalking me? And what was he trying to do? The questions haunt me. I found a small, folded paper under my wiper blade later. Not mine. With a single word scratched in crude letters. Drive. It wasn't proof, but it was enough to keep me checking my mirrors. The road feels different now. Its emptiness a threat. Its shadows alive. I don't stop at that truck stop anymore, but I still see those eyes, watching, waiting for me to slow down. Whoever he was, he's out there, and I'm still running from him. The locked door delivery. The city was asleep, its streets empty under the sodium glow of streetlights. I cruised through the night, my car's engine a low hum, the DoorDash app silent on my dashboard. Then it pinged, a late-night order, pulling me toward a place that felt wrong before I even arrived. The delivery was routine, just another McDonald's bag. But the destination was a ghost town of shuttered offices, their windows dark, their lawns wild. I turned into a lot, the building ahead squat and crumbling, its silence louder than the city I'd left behind. I parked near a gray metal door, the only sign of life a text from the customer. Bring it inside. My gut twisted, a warning I ignored as I stepped into the dark. The hallway was dim, the air stale, and then I heard it. A click, sharp and final, as the door locked behind me. This wasn't a delivery. This was a trap, and I was already inside. The bag in my hand a useless shield against whatever was coming. The building wasn't empty, and I wasn't alone. I had seconds to decide. Stay and face the hunter, or run and pray I'd find a way out before they found me. The night was no longer mine, and the truth was waiting in the shadows. I was working DoorDash this night. The hours were long, but I was used to the grind. The quiet streets a backdrop to my playlists. It was pretty late. I was used to staying up, so doing these late-night deliveries was kind of normal for me. Orders were scarce, my phone silent for too long. This night was slow. I was driving around and just listening to music while waiting for any orders to come through. When one finally did, I barely even looked at the details before accepting it since I didn't have much options anyway. The app lit up. A McDonald's order. Simple enough. I drove up to the 24/7 McDonald's and picked up their order, then had the app set me on course for the drop-off location. The drive was uneventful, the city fading into stillness. The whole drive was quiet. The roads were still, and I didn't really have any thoughts. I followed the GPS, my mind on autopilot, until the route veered into an unfamiliar area. It had me turn into I don't know what to call it. I guess it was a business area, but it didn't look like a regular one. The buildings were old, their paint peeling, their lots overgrown with weeds. Most of the buildings looked old and unused, and the grass and bushes around them were overgrown and untrimmed. It felt abandoned, a place forgotten by time. The map had me turn into a parking lot, where a small office building was. The structure was low, its windows boarded or cracked. It looked like it was only one story and was just as old and out of shape as the other places. I'd delivered to offices before, but this felt different. I had done deliveries to office buildings before, or people at work, so this was nothing out of the ordinary, really. It was just the strange nature of this area that had me put off. The lot was empty, the building lifeless. The map had me pull into what looked like the back of the building, though it was kind of hard to tell. I checked the app for details, but a message popped up. A message popped up from the customer. They said they saw me pull in and to bring it up to the gray metal door on my side of the building. I said all right, and pulled up next to the building, then got out with the bag. The door was unmarked. No signs or windows, just a slab of metal in the wall. As I walked up to it, I could tell this was definitely the back of the office. Other doors, fire exits, service entrances dotted the wall, all equally blank. I found the one they were talking about, though it was a gray metal door, with no windows or markings or anything. My phone buzzed again as I approached. My phone got another message. He just said to bring it right inside for him. I hesitated. The request odd, but not unheard of. I kind of just shrugged it off and did as he said, not thinking too hard about it. I pulled the door open and stepped inside. The McDonald's bag crinkling in my hand. I opened the door and stepped in. It was a hallway, but the main lights weren't on. It was just what I guess were the low-energy lights. Small dim light bulbs spread out down the hallway. The air was musty, the walls stained, the light barely enough to see. Honestly, I was expecting some sort of room, or like a counter, or something that would be an obvious place for me to put the food. But there was nothing, just a long, narrow corridor stretching into the dark. Was I supposed to just walk further into the building? Or was he going to meet me here? I pulled out my phone to text the customer, my thumb hovering over the screen, when a sound stopped me cold. I heard a click behind me. I turned and looked at the door. The handle didn't move. I pulled on the handle, but it was stuck. Someone just locked me in. My blood ran cold, my breath catching. All the blood rushed from my face. Panic surged, my mind racing. What did I just get myself into? I dropped the bag, its contents spilling across the floor. I dropped the bag and tried harder to open the door, but it didn't budge at all. The door was sealed, my only way out gone. My only option was to go further down the hallway and hope I could find another way out before whoever was out there finds their way to me. I moved quickly, my footsteps echoing in the dim corridor, when another sound froze me, a door opening somewhere in the building, followed by a heavy thud. Just as I started making my way down the hallway, I heard a door open and close from somewhere on the other side of the building. My heart pounded, urging me forward. I hurried running to the end and finding another door. When I opened it, there was another dimly lit hallway with a bunch of rooms on either side. The new corridor was lined with closed doors, their handles rusted. I went in, but immediately heard something from the other end. Footsteps, fast and purposeful, coming closer. I made a split-second decision and slipped into one of the office rooms and hid. I crouched behind a dusty desk, my breath shallow. The McDonald's bag abandoned somewhere behind me. A few seconds later, footsteps came rushing through the hall and right up to the door to the hallway I just came from. The steps paused, then moved on, heading toward the locked door. They went in, running down toward the locked door. I seized the chance, bolting from the room, running the opposite way. I made a run for it, going the direction the person came from and hoping to find the exit. My lungs burned, my eyes scanning for any sign of freedom. Thankfully, I did. A door loomed ahead, unmarked but unlocked. I burst through, the night air hitting me like a lifeline. I sprinted to my car, fumbling with my keys, and peeled out of the lot, my heart still racing. I ran back out to my car and drove out of there. I called the police, my voice shaking as I explained. Unfortunately, I don't think the officer on the phone understood the situation fully, because they didn't get an officer there for 20 minutes. By then, the building was empty, the lot silent. The police told me the truth later. I was informed that the office building was not in service at the moment, or hadn't been for the last 5 or so years. It was abandoned. No tenants, no cameras, no record of who might have been there. It was like partially abandoned. I guess no cameras or anything. I replayed it all. The message, the door, the footsteps. What exactly would have happened if I hadn't been quick enough to leave that hallway? The customer, if they were real, had lured me inside, locked me in, and waited. Who knows? I don't deliver to unmarked doors anymore, and I check every address twice. The night taught me one thing. Some orders aren't worth taking, and some doors are meant to stay closed. The phantom in the woods. The highway cuts through the forest, a lonely thread of asphalt under a starless sky. You're driving, the hum of your engine the only sound. When your GPS pings, destination reached. But there's nothing here, just trees and darkness. You pull over, the silence pressing against your windows. A faint glow flickers deep in the woods, soft, unnatural, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. Your skin prickles. You check the address again, but it's right. No house, no driveway, just a wall of pines. The glow pulses again, closer, like a beacon calling you into the shadows. You grip your phone, ready to call the customer, when a voice whispers in your mind, "Don't go. It's not yours, not human, but it's clear, urgent, rooting you to the spot." The glow flares once more, and now you hear it. Movement in the underbrush, deliberate, circling. Whatever's out there wants you to follow, and every instinct screams to drive away. I used to do deliveries as kind of a side gig. It was a way to make extra cash, driving through quiet streets, dropping off meals to tired families or late-night workers. This night, an order was put in at a restaurant, and I went to drop it off. I had no reason to believe this was anything other than a regular delivery order. The only slight difference was that it was a little bit farther than usual, being 20 minutes away. It was also in the other direction of most of the residential areas of our town. Our shop was near the edge, so this was just going into what I thought was a pretty barren area outside of town. Regardless, the address looked like it was just any other home address. I followed the directions, getting onto the highway. This wasn't like the typical huge 4-lane highways. It was just a 1-lane road that led from our town through the forest into the next town over. Everyone still called it the highway, though I knew there were some older neighborhoods and houses off this road, so I figured it was going to be one of them. I drove on that road for several minutes. It was pretty dead out there at that time of night. The trees loomed, their branches swallowing the moonlight. The road a tunnel through the wilderness. When the directions came to an end, though, I was taken aback. It didn't tell me to turn anywhere. It just stopped at a seemingly random point in the road and said my destination was on the right. I pulled off to the side at least to just figure out what was going on. I tried searching up the address on Google Maps and then on Apple Maps, and both of them led to exactly where I was on the road. I thought maybe I was missing something. I rolled down the window and looked out at the side of the road, but all I saw were trees. It looked like a forest and nothing else. No dirt driveways or lights or anything. The air was heavy, the kind of quiet that makes your own breathing sound loud. I decided to just call the customer and ask where the hell his house was. or if there even was a house, because honestly, part of me was thinking this was some kind of joke. The phone rang, and I put it up to my ear as I continued looking out at the forest. Only a second later, a light suddenly glowed from out in the trees. It wasn't bright, but still noticeable in the pitch-black woods. It went out after a moment, though, and before I could think about it too much, a voice came through the phone asking who was calling. I got this order here, but I think we have the wrong address. He asked me where I was, and I described the area to him. Oddly, his response was that it sounded like I was in the right place. He said there was a small driveway going into the woods. I told him I didn't see it, but he said it was hard to find, and that I might have to get out to look for it. I sighed and said, "All right," then got out and walked to the other side of my car. I started asking which direction I should look, but he suddenly hung up on me. I thought that was pretty weird, but it was even more strange when I looked up and saw that glowing light in the forest again. It shut off after only a second. My stomach twisted. A primal warning flaring. That had to be the guy I was just talking to on the phone. Why was he just standing out there and not coming up to the road? And if he was out there, then why wasn't I seeing a driveway going in that direction? I looked back down, and I guess I saw what he was talking about. There was an extremely thin, rugged dirt line going into the woods. I say line, because that's basically all it was. Definitely not a driveway. It looked like it was scrappily carved with a small shovel or something. There was no way in hell I was going to walk down that and into the forest, especially not with whatever was going on with the guy out there. The glow flickered again, deeper in the trees, and I felt it. A pull, like something wanted me to follow. I set the food on the ground right on the side of the road. As I did, I started to hear leaves moving from the bushes out in the forest. I hurried up and got in my car, then bailed out of there. Thankfully, I wasn't dumb enough to listen to the man on the phone and go into the woods. Something was wrong. I could feel it, but I didn't have anything to really prove it. What could have happened that night? I'll never know. I drove back, heart racing, the forest a blur in my mirrors. The highway felt endless, each shadow a threat. I called the restaurant, told them the delivery was a bust, but I didn't explain the glow, the voice, the path that wasn't a path. They shrugged it off. Wrong addresses happen. But this wasn't a mistake. Whoever was out there had planned this, luring me to that spot. I stopped taking deliveries to remote areas after that, sticking to city streets, bright lights. But the memory of that light haunted me, flickering in my dreams, calling me back to the woods. The town moved on, but I didn't. I'd check my GPS obsessively, double-checking addresses, avoiding roads that led nowhere. What was that glow? A flashlight? Something else? The customer's voice, calm but insistent, replayed in my head. His words too precise, too knowing. Had he been watching me from the trees, waiting for me to step into his trap? I never found the address again, never saw that light. But some nights, driving alone, I'd feel it, a presence, just beyond the headlights, waiting for me to pull over. The cabin trap. The night was black, the kind that swallowed headlights and made the world feel small. I was 2 months into my gig at Domino's, slinging pizzas across town for tips that made the long hours bearable. I used to work for Domino's. I only had the job for a couple of months, but for the most part, I didn't find it to be too bad. The shop was a hub of chaos, orders piling up even late at night. Our store was always open until 12:00, and we got a surprising amount of orders that late. 2. I clocked in, ready for the grind. The hum of the oven and the chatter of the crew a familiar rhythm. Like, we stayed steady throughout the night all the way up until closing. But this order, one of the last of the night, felt different from the start. It took me somewhere new. The address led me away from the usual neighborhoods, out to the woodsy edge of town, where the streets grew narrow and the trees loomed tall. This one took me to the more spread out and woodsy part of town. I'd always pictured this area as a hideout for the wealthy, their mansions tucked behind pines. But at night, it was just darkness and silence. I always thought this was where the rich people had their isolated mansions hidden in the trees. But at night, it didn't look like much of anything was out there. My GPS pinged, directing me to a gravel road lit by sparse lamps. I drove until the directions told me to turn down a gravel road. It was wide and had lamps on the sides guiding me down the whole way. The road ended abruptly. The gravel path split into 5 narrow trails, too tight for my car, and at the end, it split off into 5 smaller paths, too thin for a car to fit down. A sign read, "Welcome to Frosted Oak Cabins," a rental property lost in the woods. There was a sign there that said something like, "Welcome to the Frosted Oak Cabins." It was a cabin rental property. The order specified Cabin 3. I looked back at the address that was on the order and it said, Cabin 3 at the end. I found the path marked for it, lined with dim, flickering lamps. I looked at the signs next to each path and found one that led to Cabin 3. I parked, grabbed the pizzas, and stepped into the night. I parked the car and picked up the pizzas, then began walking. The path felt endless. The lamps were weak, casting pools of light that vanished into the dark. These paths had dimmer and smaller lamps going along them, so I couldn't see down very far. I moved from one to the next, blind between them, clutching the pizza boxes tightly. The dim lamps felt even worse as I got further in, because I almost couldn't see anything until I was right up next to one. My footsteps crunched on the gravel, the only sound besides crickets and rustling leaves. The woods were pretty calm, though, just the sound of crickets and the leaves rustling in the wind. It felt like forever, though it was only a few minutes. Before I reached the end, I think I walked for 3 or 4 minutes, though it felt like longer. Before I made it to the last lamp and the end of the path, the cabin was wrong. A small structure sat in a clearing, its single window dark, no sign of life. There was a little opening in a very small cabin in the middle. I approached, unease creeping up my spine. It had a window on the front, and oddly, there was no light coming from it. The cabin was dark. I knocked, the sound echoing inside, but no one answered. I walked up and knocked on the door. I could hear the knock echo inside the cabin, but there wasn't the slightest sound in return. I dialed the number on the order, letting it ring until it cut off. I pulled my phone out and called the number on the order. It rang for a whole minute and ended without anyone answering. I stood there, debating whether to leave, when my phone buzzed with a text from the same number. Then I got a text. It was from the same number I just called. It read, "Not at the cabin. Doors unlocked. Leave the pizzas inside. Thanks." The text read, "I'm not at the cabin right now. The door is unlocked. Please leave the pizzas on the table inside. Thanks." I hesitated, my hand on the knob. I turned and faced the door again, then twisted the handle. It felt like crossing a line, stepping into someone's space uninvited. I pushed the door open just a little bit. I know they told me to, but it still felt kind of wrong. The cabin was pitch black, a void of shadows. All the lights were off, and it was extremely dark. "Hello? Anyone home?" I called, my voice swallowed by the silence. "Hello, is anyone home?" With no reply, I pushed the door further open and took a few steps inside. The room was simple, a single open space with a table and a door at the far end. Likely a bedroom. It looked like just one long open room and maybe a small bedroom at the end. I moved to the table, setting down the pizzas, my eyes adjusting to the dark. I went over to the table and started setting down the food. Then I heard it, a faint creak, like a floorboard giving way. When I heard a creak, my gaze snapped to the bedroom door. My eyes shot over to the bedroom door, not getting to even think before it suddenly opened. It swung wide, and a man stepped out, his silhouette filling the frame. I almost had a heart attack. I thought nobody was home. A man appeared in the doorway and started walking toward me. I froze. He moved fast, too fast. His voice saying something about a tip, but his tone was off, his steps aggressive. As I nervously stuttered over my words, the man tried to tell me he had my tip and was thanking me for bringing it inside, but he was walking aggressively fast toward me. I backed away, my heart hammering. I backed up as he got just a couple feet away. His face twisted, rage flashing in his eyes as he lunged. He jumped forward trying to grab me as his face shifted into rage. I bolted for the door, my legs pumping, and burst outside, only to crash into another figure. I ran out the front door, but instantly slammed into someone else. He hit the grass, and I stumbled, but caught myself, sprinting down the path. He fell in the grass, and I caught myself from falling, sprinting back to the path. I was prey. Their footsteps pounded behind me, but the dim lamps hid them, their shapes lost in the dark. I heard both of them chase after me, but every time I glanced back, they weren't within the light of any of the lamps. I ran blind, the pizza boxes long forgotten, my breath ragged. I made it to my car and sped out before they ever caught up to me. I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911 as I floored it, the gravel road blurring past. I called the police. I gave them everything, the order, the number, the cabin, but it was no use. Both men were gone, of course, but I was hoping that with the order, phone number, and cabin rental, they'd easily be able to identify them. They'd used a fake number, a gift card, and broken into an unrented cabin. However, they couldn't. They broke into the unrented cabin, used a fake phone number, and paid online with a Visa gift card. There was nothing to identify them with. The police searched, but the men had vanished, leaving nothing but my fear. Thinking back on what happened is almost more terrifying. It was a trap, planned to lure me inside. Obviously, it was their plan to get me out there and into the cabin so they could trap me inside. The second man, was he in the woods, watching me walk down that path? But the other guy came out of nowhere. Was he out there in the woods watching me the whole time, waiting for me to go in? If he'd been faster, I wouldn't have made it out. Had he been just a moment faster, they would have succeeded. I don't know what they wanted, but the thought of it keeps me awake. And I don't know what they would have done. I quit Domino's soon after, unable to face another late-night delivery. The woods, once just a backdrop, now feel alive with unseen eyes. I drive different routes, avoid gravel roads, and check my rearview mirror more than I should. Some nights, when the wind whispers through the trees, I see that cabin door opening, the man's face shifting, and I wonder how close I came to never coming back. The voice in the empty house. The winter chill clung to the air, the neighborhood's lights fading as I drove deeper into the unknown. I was 23, a college kid, picking up DoorDash gigs to make ends meet during break. I spent most of my free time doing DoorDash just to make a quick buck. The order was hefty, 2 bulging bags of food, destined for a street I'd never seen. I picked up a big order, like 2 full bags of food, then started heading to the address. The GPS led me through a maze of suburban homes, down a winding road that seemed to stretch forever. It took me through it down a long winding road of normal houses and all the way to the back of the neighborhood. At the end, a wooden gate loomed, its numbers matching my delivery. My headlights lit up a small wooden gate with numbers on it. It matched the address to my delivery order. No other house had a gate. This one stood apart, hidden down a private drive. It was strange, though. None of the other houses had gates, and were all just along the street. Yet this one seemed to be down a long personal driveway. I stepped out, the gravel crunching underfoot, and pushed the gate open. No lock, just a creak. I got out and opened the gate. It didn't have a lock or anything. I just pushed it open. Back in my car, I followed the path through a tunnel of trees, their branches clawing at the sky. I got back in the car and drove down this wide gravel road through some trees before reaching a single house at the end. The house at the end was old, wooden, smaller than the others, its weathered facade stark in my headlights. It was definitely older than all the others, all wooden and kind of small. Every window was dark, yet the front door gaped wide, a black maw in the night. I noticed none of their lights were on, like not a single one. Yet, the front door was wide open. I grabbed the bags, leaving my car running, its beams cutting through the gloom. I got out with the order. I left my car on, so my headlights were lighting up the front of the house. The porch was silent, the house's stillness oppressive, like it was holding its breath. When I got up to the porch, I could hear just how quiet it was inside. Such a big order, and yet it was like nobody was home. I set the bags down, ready to leave, when a voice called from upstairs. A voice called out from somewhere upstairs. "Hey, just bring it up here for me." Bud. It was casual, almost friendly, but it sent a shiver down my spine. There was a staircase right by the entrance, but it was so dark inside. I couldn't see the top of the stairs. I stepped inside, the darkness swallowing me, the staircase a void leading to nothing. Stupidly, I took a couple steps inside. The voice called again, closer, from the top of the stairs. "Atta boy. I'll grab it from you. Right up here." It was in that pocket of shadow where light refused to reach. His voice came from right at the top, in that pocket of darkness that I couldn't see anything in. The house's silence pressed against me, the air thick with wrongness. The eerie stillness and silence of the house made me increasingly more unsettled. My foot hovered over the next step, but instinct screamed to stop. As I approached the steps, I snapped out of it and backed out. I dropped the bags on the porch, sprinting to my car. I dropped the food on the porch on my way out and ran back to my car. I drove away, the house's open door a haunting image in my rear view. I didn't know what to do after that, so I just went home and told nobody about it. Days later, curiosity drove me to check the address. A few days later, though, I looked up the address, and sure enough, it wasn't supposed to be occupied. It was an abandoned house owned by the state. The state owned it, vacant, condemned, no residents. What was waiting for me at the top of those stairs is something I'm glad to never know. Locals whispered of that house, stories of disappearances, of voices luring delivery drivers or wanderers. Some said it was squatters. Others swore it was something older, something that didn't belong. I dug into records, finding reports of missing persons linked to that road. Cases cold for decades. The order haunted me. Why so much food for an empty house? I quit DoorDash, unable to face another night delivery, the voice echoing in my mind. That house still stands, its door open in my nightmares, waiting for someone to climb those stairs. The quiet of that night was a lie, hiding something I'll never face. The silent watchers. The woods were our sanctuary, a place to escape, to breathe, to be free. But some places don't welcome you. They watch, they wait, and they hunt. My name is Lucas, and this is the story of the night the forest turned on us, when shadows became figures, and we ran from eyes that never blinked. The campsite was remote, a hidden clearing reached only by a long hike, its silence a promise of peace. But peace is a lie when the trees have secrets, and we were fools to think we were alone. A distant fire, a flicker in the dark, was our first warning. But it was the figures, dozens of them, silent, staring, that told us we'd never been alone. We fled, but the woods kept their truth, and I still feel those eyes, watching, waiting, forever. Me and my older brother, Cameron, were doing a camping trip on the East Coast. Cameron chose the site, and everything like he usually did, and I just tagged along. He was the planner, the one who knew the trails, the one I trusted to lead. He chose well, though. The campsite was really nice, and since we had to hike to get there, it wasn't crowded. The forest was a cathedral of pines, its quiet a balm for city-weary souls. There was nobody around from what we could see. The campsite wasn't very defined, though it was hard to tell if we were even in the right spot. Clearings dotted the woods, each one a potential camp, but we picked one and called it home. The air was crisp, the ground soft, but something felt off, like the forest was holding its breath. There were several openings in the trees that looked like they could have been the place we were supposed to be at, but neither of us thought it mattered. We set up on one of the grassy openings, and while we initially thought this place wasn't very active, we started to notice we were wrong. Our tents went up, our fire sparked to life, but the woods weren't as empty as we thought. There were leftover things scattered around. Nothing big like entire tents or anything, but just small things like a trekking pole or some old shoes, a rusted knife, a torn backpack strap, things no camper would leave behind. It wasn't normal for these things to be left behind. Though, not at campsites like this that were far out. We both thought it was weird, but we went on with our day. We shrugged it off, our laughter drowning out the unease. But the relics stayed with me, whispers of others who'd been here. We didn't really do much, just hung out and talked. When it got darker out, we lit up a fire and sat around it. The flames danced, our stories weaving through the night, the forest a silent audience. A couple hours into the night, I happened to spot something behind Cameron. I pointed it out, not sure what it was. Both of us looked, and after a few moments, we were able to tell that it was a small campfire. It was a pinprick of orange, far beyond the trees, a beacon in the void. It was really far out, impartially blocked by all the trees, but the tiny orange flame was flickering in the distance. The clouds had swallowed the moon, the darkness absolute, making the flame a solitary star. I squinted, my heart uneasy. The fire too far for a campsite, too deliberate for chance. Had it not been for the moonlight being covered by the clouds and the absolute darkness of the woods, there was no way we would have been able to notice it. I guess we weren't alone. Though, the realization was a chill. The forest no longer ours. It was a little odd that they were out in that direction because it seemed like it was just forest over there. No openings or anything to really set up a campsite. No trails, no clearings, just trees and shadow. Maybe they wanted to be away from other people or something. We didn't think about it too much. We turned back to our fire, our snacks, our stories, but the distant flame lingered in my mind, a question without an answer. The night deepened, the woods growing heavier, as if they knew something we didn't. We got some snacks and drinks out and talked ourselves into exhaustion. We put out the fire and went to bed. The tent was a cocoon, the forest's hum a lullaby. I fell asleep pretty comfortably, not having any trouble at all. Though, sleep came easy, the day's hike a weight that pulled me under. I woke up at some point in the night. It must have only been an hour or two after I'd gone to sleep. I knew exactly why I had woken up, though I drank a bit too much right before bed. My bladder protested, the cold air biting as I unzipped the tent. Needing to relieve myself, I got up and unzipped the tent. I walked out maybe feet from the campsite to make sure I didn't attract any animals, and did my business. The woods were silent, the ground soft under my boots, but the dark was oppressive, a living thing. I finished, zipping up, ready to return, when I saw it, the distant fire, still burning, a defiant glow. But as I was out there, I noticed the flame way out in the forest was still lit up. It was hypnotic, a beacon in the void, drawing my gaze. Maybe it was because I was tired, or just out of it for some reason. But I stood there and stared at it for a minute. I don't even know why. But my eyes began adjusting to the dark as I stood there. The world sharpened, shadows taking form, and my breath caught. And as I looked out into the woods, I suddenly noticed something else. It looked like a figure somewhere far out between me and the distant flame I was looking at. A silhouette, tall and still, stood against the faint glow. I felt a shock for a moment, but I told myself it couldn't actually be a person and had to be a weird-looking bush or something. Like there was no way someone was out in the dark outside our camp at this time of night. I blinked, willing it to be a trick of the light, but it didn't move. Then I saw another, and another, shapes in the dark, too human, too many, but I kept looking, trying to make out what I could. When I started to notice more of these figuring shadows in the woods, they were everywhere, scattered among the trees, their outlines sharpening as my eyes adjusted. They were so far, and it was so dark. I couldn't tell if my mind was just playing tricks on me, if they were people, though there were at least 10 or 15 of them, and they seemed to all be looking right at me. Their stillness was unnatural, their gazes a weight I could feel. Another shock ran through me. What the hell is this? I almost thought I was hallucinating. My heart pounded, my legs frozen. The forest no longer a refuge but a trap. I turned around and hurried back to the tent. I debated for a second whether to wake Cameron up. His tent was a lifeline, but doubt gnawed at me. What if I was wrong? I knew if it was nothing, I would never hear the end of it. But my gut was telling me otherwise. I opened his tent and shook him awake. He groaned, his eyes bleary. But my urgency cut through. He was really confused at first, but I just told him I thought I saw something and wanted a second opinion. My voice trembled, betraying my fear. He hesitantly got up, and I started to lead him out to where I was. But we didn't get very far. The air was wrong, too thick, too alive. The figures I had seen had moved. They were closer, standing all spread out among the trees. They were no longer shadows, but people. Their forms undeniable, their silence deafening. I really hoped at this point I was just seeing things. But I slowly looked back at Cameron and could see the pale, fear-covered expression on his face. His eyes wide open. His fear was a mirror. His confidence shattered. He saw what I saw. I looked back out, and it was more apparent than ever that these were people. I could see their subtle movements as they stood there and watched us. They shifted, slight but deliberate, their eyes glinting in the dark. We backed up towards our tents. Should we leave? I can still vividly remember Cameron's shaky voice as he spoke those words. His voice was a stranger's, raw with terror. He was always so confident and sure of what to do. It was terrifying seeing and hearing him like that. I nodded, my throat tight, my mind screaming to run. I nodded, and neither of us grabbed any of our stuff aside from the car keys and our wallets. We hurried away and down the trail. The trail was a blur, branches snapping underfoot, the dark pressing in. It seemed that they didn't follow us. We reported what happened to the police, feeling it was necessary. The station was a harsh light. The officers' skepticism a slap. They didn't take it too seriously. Though, very clearly thinking we were crazy. Like there was no way a whole group of people were out in the woods at night messing with us. Their laughter stung, but we knew what we saw. We thought about the strange amount of left-behind things we saw in the area, and had hoped others had already gone to the police about similar encounters. But nobody had. The trekking pole, the shoes, they weren't accidents, but warnings. There were no official accounts of anything happening there. Maybe they just went unreported. Or maybe nobody ever made it back to report it. The thought was a knife. The truth a shadow we couldn't escape. We never went back. Never spoke of it again. But the woods are still there. And so are they. Watching. Waiting. Silent. The lure in the dark. I live in a pretty woodsy town, like with lots of forests around it, and plenty of small campgrounds within an hour or so. The trees were my escape, a promise of peace. But that weekend, they hit a predator. I decided to head to one of these campgrounds for a laid-back weekend camping trip. I wanted solitude, a chance to breathe. But I got something else, a trap, carefully set. His smile was a lie, his words a lure, and by the time I saw the knife, I was already running for my life. The forest still holds his shadow, waiting for the next lone camper. The campground I chose was a small one, where you park in a small dirt area and choose one of the 3 sites they had to set up your tent at. It was a forgotten place, tucked deep in the woods, far from the world's noise. There were already fire pits set up, and even some grills and benches. They looked awful, but I guess some people still use them. The air was crisp, the trees a dense wall around me. All 3 spots were open though, and no other cars were there. So I just chose the one on the far left and put all my things over there. My tent went up quickly, a small claim to this wild place. The walk from my truck to the campsite was only about 5 minutes, but the area was very densely covered in trees, so it still felt like I was fully in the woods. I was alone, or so I thought. It was about an hour in that I realized I had no idea what to do. Like, should I just sit here and relax or read a book? I didn't really know. The silence was heavy, the forest too vast. I thought maybe there was a trail or something I could walk on, so I went back to where the entrance was to see if there was anything. The dirt lot was unchanged. My truck, a lone sentinel. There wasn't. But there was another car next to mine now. It was wrong, out of place. It was an old red Toyota, like really old, rusted all around and with dents and scratches all over. It didn't belong. And one really strange thing I noticed about it was it didn't have a license plate on either the front or the batotasho. No plates, no trace, a ghost car in the wilderness. I didn't really know what to think, but I figured they must have been camping at one of the other spots. I pushed the unease aside, returning to my site, with no trail. Though, I went back to my campsite and just sat on a log. The forest watched, its silence a weight. After only 10 minutes, I heard footsteps coming up behind me. He was here. I looked back. There was a guy walking down the trail. His steps were deliberate, his gaze fixed on me. He had no backpack or anything, and he was looking right at me like he was coming down just to talk to me or ask me something. No gear, no purpose, just him. The man looked like he was in his 30s, but he almost looked older because of how he was put together, or rather, not put together. His clothes were a patchwork of neglect, his face weathered beyond his years. His brown jacket had holes all over it and was covered in stains, and his beard and hair were oily and shaggy. His voice was too calm. "You wouldn't happen to be able to help me with something real quick, would you?" he asked. It was a question, but it felt like a command. Having nothing to do, I said, "Sure," and stood up. My politeness was a reflex, a mistake, but he quickly said thank you and that he was just asking for now. His smile was thin, practiced. He still had some things to do first, but he was going to come back in a little bit and get me when he needed a hand. Why come now? Then. I said okay, and he thanked me again, then walked away. I waited, uneasy. I wasn't too sure why he came by if he didn't need me right now, but I figured he probably just had to unpack his car first and would be back in 10 or 15 minutes. The forest swallowed his steps, leaving me alone. I sat and waited. But a half hour passed, and then another. The sun dipped low, painting the trees in shadow. By then, the sun was going down, and I thought he must have gotten it done himself, whatever it was. I let it go. The fire pit my new focus. I had the fire pit lit up and was making my dinner when I heard footsteps behind me again. He was back. I looked back, but this time it was eerily dark. The night was a void, the trail invisible. I could hear his footsteps coming down the trail, but he was completely covered in darkness. I couldn't even see his silhouette. The crunch of gravel was a countdown, each step closer. I listened to the crunching steps against the gravel slowly make their way into the light of my campfire. The flames revealed him, unchanged, his eyes glinting. It was the same man, just as I thought. I didn't understand why he came back, though his words were a trap. "Hey, you ready? Just need a little help still?" His tone was light, but it carried an edge. With what?" I needed answers, not games. He noticed my hesitation. "It'll only take a minute. You aren't busy by the looks of it," he said jokingly with a smile. But it felt odd, like he was being pushy. His humor was a mask, his avoidance a warning. He also avoided my question. My instincts screamed to stay put. My social awkwardness kind of failed me here, though, because I nervously agreed, knowing I really had nothing else to do. And it was obvious. I followed, blind. He smiled again and started leading the way. The campfire's glow faded, the dark closing in. As we got further from my campfire, it got way darker, and I realized how odd it was that he walked here without a flashlight. No light, no gear, just him, moving with purpose. It also felt strange following him into the dark. The trees loomed, their branches clawing at the sky. "Hey, so what was it you needed my help for?" I asked. My voice trembled, seeking clarity. He slowed down for a split second like he was going to say something, but then he continued walking, and didn't answer. I was in danger. I felt my heart rate spiking. My body knew before my mind did. My body knew something was wrong. The forest was too quiet. Its silence a predator's pause. Suddenly, the silence of the forest around me felt disturbingly eerie, like a calm before the storm. I slowed my steps, desperate for distance. I began slowing down, trying to put some distance between us without it being too obvious. Every instinct screamed to run. I only managed to get a few feet away before he turned around and looked at me. His mask fell. He had a creepy fake smile that immediately shifted into a frown when he saw me further away. His eyes were cold, calculating. He stopped walking, and so did I. The air was thick, charged with threat. Before I could say anything, I saw his hand reach down into his jacket, and I immediately turned and sprinted deeper into the woods after just seeing the handle of what I could only assume was a knife. The glint of metal was all I needed. I could hear his footsteps pounding against the ground and his heavy breathing as he chased me through the dark for probably a good 2 minutes. Branches snapped, his pursuit relentless. He started slowing down, and eventually it was just the sound of me running through the woods. I escaped. Barely. Luckily, I had my phone and keys on me, so I called 911. My voice shook, the forest a maze around me. When they got to the camping grounds, only my truck was there. The red Toyota was gone. A phantom vanished. The red car was gone, and so was the man. The campsite was empty, my fire cold. I described everything for them as both the car and the man had such a distinct look. But that information wasn't enough. The police were kind, but helpless. I think it's pretty clear what was about to happen that night. He'd planned it all. I found a small, rusted key near my tent later. Not mine. Its edges worn, but sharp. It wasn't proof, but it was enough to keep me from ever camping alone again. The forest feels different now. Its silence a threat. Its shadows alive with his intent. He waited, watched, lured me with a smile, and I almost followed him into the dark. Whoever he was, he's still out there, waiting for the next camper to trust his lies. The shadow at the lake, the campfire's glow flickered, a fragile shield against the endless dark of the Minnesota woods. The lake lapped softly in the distance, its rhythm steady, but the silence between its waves was heavy, alive with something unseen. Watching from the trees, I'd come alone, my tent pitched deep in the forest, seeking solitude by the water's edge. The woods were my escape, a place where the world's noise faded. But tonight, the quiet wasn't peaceful. It was predatory. A stillness that pressed against my chest, whispering that I wasn't alone. My eyes darted to the tree line, the darkness beyond the fire's reach swallowing everything. I told myself it was nothing, just the mind playing tricks in the wild. But the feeling grew, a weight in my gut, a certainty that something was out there, studying me. The night stretched on, each rustle of leaves a threat, each snap of a twig a warning. I gripped my bear spray, my heart pounding, knowing the woods held secrets I wasn't ready to face, and one of them was closer than I thought. This wasn't the freedom I'd come for. This was a hunt, and I was the prey, caught in a game I didn't understand, with a shadow waiting to step into the light. I had taken time off work to go camping at a small lake in northern Minnesota. The lake was a familiar retreat, a place I'd visited with others before. It was a place I'd been to a couple of times with friends or family that decided to join me, but this time it was just me. The trail to the campsite was gentle, a flat path through dense forest. The hike to get there took about 2 hours, but it wasn't too rigorous. Mostly just flat trail all the way there. I set up my tent and other things a bit into the woods so as to not be right up against the lake. The trees offered cover, a buffer from the open water. Then I unfolded my chair, popped open a beer, and listened to the calm sounds of the water and the birds chirping. The day was fading, the sun dipping low. It was already late into the day, so I didn't have much time before the sun started going down. I always enjoyed nighttime in the woods, though. It was always so quiet and almost felt freeing in a way. The stars were sharp, the air cool, the world reduced to simple sounds. I don't know how else to describe it, however, this night was different. As darkness fell, I built a fire, its warmth a comfort. Once the sun went down, I built up a campfire and continued relaxing, but something shifted. This feeling came over me that usually didn't happen. I felt like I was being watched. My skin prickled, my eyes scanning the black beyond the firelight. I kept looking around at the trees and the darkness that surrounded me, having this uneasy, almost paranoid feeling. I wasn't prone to this, not out here. I was never like this, so I wasn't sure what was going on. Every time I looked around, though, I didn't see anything at all. The dark was too thick, a wall I couldn't pierce. The problem was that it was so dark I'm not sure I would have been able to see anything, even if there was something or someone out there watching me. I tried to shake it off, blaming my nerves. Of course, with no real reason to feel the way I did. I did my best to suppress the thoughts and try to ease my mind away from it. I focused on my life, my problems, anything to drown out the paranoia. Eventually, I was able to distract myself by thinking about some personal stuff I had going on in my life. The fire crackled, the night wore on, and I almost convinced myself I was fine. But the woods had other plans. There was a very sudden and loud crack in front of me, like a large stick snapping under heavy weight from somewhere right ahead of me. The sound echoed, sharp and violent, cutting through the silence. It was pitch black out there. I couldn't see anything. The sound was so loud, though it echoed across the woods. My body tensed, a shiver running down my spine. A shiver ran through me. It sounded like something heavy stepping on a branch. Was it a bear? A person? Was it a large animal? Or was it a person? I wasn't sure which I was more afraid of. I grabbed my bear spray, my hand trembling. I pulled out my bear spray, then called out, "Hello, someone out there?" My voice was swallowed by the dark. No reply, no rustle. There was not even the slightest sound in response to my voice. If it was an animal, I'd hear it moving, brushing through the undergrowth. I couldn't help but feel like if it were a large animal, I would have heard them walking around, brushing up against the bushes and crunching the leaves. I sat frozen, staring into the void, waiting for another sound. I kind of just sat there for a minute, staring out into the dark and waiting to see or hear something. Then I remembered my flashlight. I'd brought a flashlight with me. I dug through my backpack and grabbed it. I fumbled with it, my fingers clumsy. But by then, it had already been a minute or two, and when I shined it out there, it was empty. Nothing out there at all. The beam revealed nothing but trees and dirt. Yet the unease lingered, sharper now. Obviously, I was starting to feel paranoid again, but this time it felt justified. I fed the fire, piling on wood to keep it blazing. I quickly tended to the fire, adding in some more wood to make sure it didn't burn out and stayed bright enough to light up my campsite. Every few minutes, I swept the flashlight across the trees. Every couple minutes, I turned my flashlight back on and just scanned the area. Then it happened. One time I turned it on, I immediately saw something at the far end of the light. It was a person, definitely a man. He was tall, towering, his frame massive in the beam's edge. They were freakishly tall, not like inhuman or anything, but maybe like 6'5". He moved fast, slipping beyond the light's reach, They instantly moved out of the light, going further back where the light couldn't reach. My heart slammed against my ribs, adrenaline flooding me. My adrenaline was pumping. Had my gut feeling been right this whole time? That crack. It had to be him. His weight breaking the branch. I thought back to the sound I heard earlier, and how it sounded like something large enough to make such a loud crack sound. He was huge, easily 250 pounds. The guy I saw was huge at that height. He was probably 250, those at least. He'd been there, watching. For hours, maybe. It had to have been him, which means he was out there watching me for who knows how long. I didn't think. I acted. I panicked, taking down my tent and shoving my belongings into my backpack. My hands shook as I stuffed gear inside. The fire's light my only shield. I knew which way he ran from the light, so I ran off in the opposite direction, which also happened to be back toward my car. The trail was a blur, my breath ragged as I fled. After a while, I felt safe enough to turn on my flashlight on the dim setting and walk the rest of the way. As I moved, my mind raced, piecing together the night. While I walked, I tried to think up reasons for him being out there. Why hadn't he approached? Something definitely would have happened. I have no doubt about it. But the guy was huge. Why didn't he just attack me or rob me right away? Was he waiting for me to sleep? The only thing I could think of is if he might have been trying to see if I had a gun or weapon on me, or he could have just been waiting for me to go to sleep. I reached my car, my hands trembling as I unlocked it. I got back to my car and drove home. The road stretched ahead, the lake fading behind me, but the fear stayed. I still go out camping, but it's never been the same since that night. The woods, once my refuge, now hold a shadow I can't shake. Now I always have that paranoid feeling like I'm being watched from somewhere that I can't see. I scan the dark, my flashlight never far, praying it's just a feeling, nothing more. But some nights, I still hear that crack, and I wonder if he's still out there, waiting for me to return. The blizzard phantom. The blizzard howls outside, a wall of snow sealing you in your home. You're curled on the couch, lulled by the TV's glow, when a sharp sound slices through your sleep. A single, human noise. Too close, inside your walls. You jolt awake, the house swallowed by darkness. The air is heavy, wrong, as if someone's breath lingers just beyond your sight. The storm rages, but that sound wasn't the wind. You stand, heart hammering, peering into the black. A shadow shifts down the hallway. Fleeting, silent. You're not alone, and the blizzard traps you both. You reach for the light, trembling, but the cold seeps in. A whisper of movement behind you. Whoever's here, they've been here all along. The storm screams, but it's the silence inside that terrifies you. They're moving, watching, and there's nowhere to run in this frozen cage. There was a severe blizzard going on this night. I had actually called off from work, just so I didn't have to risk driving there. It was a complete whiteout. I couldn't see more than a couple feet away because the flurry of snow was blocking everything. The world outside was erased, a swirling void that pressed against the windows, isolating me in my small house. I stayed in all day, and something about the weather made me feel like cozying up on the couch at night and falling asleep while watching TV. The hum of the television, the flicker of old sitcoms, wrapped me in a false sense of safety. I'm not even sure when I actually fell asleep. I woke up very suddenly to someone making a noise. It was just one sound, and I couldn't really tell which direction it came from or how far it was because I was asleep when it happened. Immediately, I noticed how dark it was. Though, like the whole house was pitch black. The TV had shut off. The power likely cut by the storm, but the sound was from someone outside my front door during a blizzard. I stood, my blanket sliding to the floor, and crept to the window. I got up and looked out. It was still completely white outside. I couldn't see anything. The snow was relentless, a curtain of white that hid the world. I was really confused. Though, had I even really heard something? Or was it one of those weird, real-feeling dreams? I strained to listen, but the storm's roar drowned everything, except the unease curling in my gut. I turned around to walk back to the couch, but I caught something in the side of my eye down the hallway, like something moving. My breath caught, the darkness thicker now, alive. I flicked on the light. I stared down the hallway for a moment. "Is someone in here?" I nervously spoke. I felt adrenaline building up in me. I still wasn't sure what I saw, but I felt trapped. I couldn't run out into the blizzard. I was stuck inside, maybe with someone else. The hallway stretched before me, its shadows deeper than they should be. I gripped the wall, my pulse a drumbeat, each step heavier than the last. I quietly walked down the hallway, but before I got to the end, there were several quick noises followed by the heavy wind suddenly flying into the house. I froze, the cold biting my skin. I turned the corner. The window on the far end of the room was wide open. Someone had just run out. It felt like my body shut down for a second, but I ran up and closed the window, then called the police. The storm screamed through the gap, snow spilling onto the floor, erasing any trace of who'd been there. Every sign and trace of the intruder was already covered up in the blizzard by the time they arrived. There's no saying who they were or what they were doing in my home. The police searched, their flashlights useless against the whiteout, and left with nothing but apologies. I stood in the empty room, the window locked but the chill lingering, as if the intruder had left something behind. The house didn't feel mine anymore. The blizzard had trapped me, but it had also hidden them. Whoever they were, had they been inside while I slept, watching from the shadows? I checked every lock, every window, but the storm had buried their footprints, their purpose. What did they want? Were they still out there, waiting for the snow to clear? I slept with the lights on for weeks, jumping at every gust of wind. The blizzard had been my prison, but it was also their cloak, letting them slip away unseen. I moved soon after, unable to shake the sense that the house held secrets I'd never uncover. Some nights, when the wind howls, I hear that sound again, a single, human note, echoing from the dark. The date that wasn't. The city lights blurred past as I drove to the bar, my heart light with the promise of a good night. I was 32, a Navy vet grinding through college on the GI Bill, my days packed with classes and a part-time job. I'm a 32-year-old guy currently using my GI Bill to go to college in a city in one of the mountain time zone states. Socializing was a luxury I couldn't afford, so I leaned on dating apps to connect. I'm so busy with school and work, so I don't have time to go out and socialize often. So I have to rely on a lot of the apps to go on dates. I'd matched with Sarah, a woman my age with a warm smile and sharp wit. I matched with this really cute girl around my age, and we had a good conversation, and then we scheduled a date. Our chats flowed easily, and I felt a spark I hadn't in a while. It was at a bar restaurant not far for either of us to drive, so it was easy. She was everything I'd hoped. The bar was cozy, strung with Christmas lights, the air buzzing with holiday cheer. It was very pretty in person, and we got along great. Sarah was even more striking in person, her laugh infectious as we traded stories over drinks. During our conversation, I found out that she worked in a non-cop role at the police station, like a receptionist essentially. She worked at the police station, not as a cop, but behind a desk, handling calls and paperwork. I also learned she had a roommate whom she said was out of town for the holidays. Her roommate was away for the holidays, leaving her alone in their shared house. She added that she hated being alone because she had a crazy ex-boyfriend who stalked her. That gave me pause. She mentioned a stalker ex, someone who'd made her life hell. I was a little uneasy at that, and I told her as much, and she said he's harmless. So I kind of let it go. She brushed it off, calling him harmless, and I let it slide, chalking it up to a bad breakup. The night took a turn. We lingered at the bar, the drinks loosening our tongues, the conversation growing warmer. We had a few more drinks, and so we were there for about another hour. And at her suggestion, we said that we should go back to her place. Sarah suggested we head to her place, her eyes playful, and I agreed, the thrill of the moment overriding caution. We went to her house, and she walked up and just opened the door. She didn't unlock it. It was already open, which I found very odd, because she said she had a stalker, that her roommate was gone. We pulled up to her house, a small bungalow in a quiet neighborhood, and she walked straight in. No key, no lock. I found very odd, because she said she had a stalker that her roommate was gone. A stalker, and she left her door unlocked? My instincts twitched, but I followed her inside. The house felt off. Sarah knelt to feed her cat, the kitchen lit by a single bulb. She started feeding her cat, and as she was doing that, I saw a bowl of cereal on the kitchen counter. On the counter sat a bowl of cereal, the milk still cold, the flakes crisp. I touched it, and it was still cold, like it hadn't been there for a while. The cereal wasn't soggy either. I asked who it belonged to, my voice casual but sharp. I asked her whose it was, and she hesitated and said she ate it as a snack before heading to the bar. But it just didn't make sense. She paused, then said she'd eaten it before the bar, but the math didn't add up. She'd been with me for hours. Before I could say anything, she just kissed me and put her arms around me. She cut me off with a kiss, her arms pulling me close, her voice low and teasing. Seductively said for me to take her to her room. It was a trap. We moved to her bedroom, the air thick with tension. We started fooling around, and I went to close the curtains, and she told me to leave them open. I reached for the curtains, but she stopped me, insisting they stay open. A few minutes later, maybe 5, we were in bed, and my back was to the window, and she let out a huge gasp, a scared gasp. Minutes later, her eyes widened, a sharp gasp escaping her lips. Her eyes were at the window. I spun around, catching a glimpse of a hooded figure outside, bolting into the dark. I turned around and saw someone in a hoodie, and they took off. Footsteps thudded on the back deck. I heard the steps running on her back deck. I leapt up, adrenaline surging, and checked the doors. I immediately jumped up and ran out to make sure her doors were locked. And of course, the front door wasn't. The front door was unlocked. Swinging slightly, I ran to it and locked it. The lock clicked, and instantly, someone pounded on the door, the force rattling the frame. And right when I did, the door started banging. I gripped the knob, ready to confront whoever was out there, my Navy training kicking in. I went to open it because I was going to the dude up, or at least try to. Sarah's voice stopped me, calm, almost dismissive, and she told me to just go back to bed with her. I rounded on her, my voice sharp. I screamed at her and asked if she was insane. She shrugged, saying he always did this, and left. She told me he does this and goes away. I demanded to know if it was her ex, and I asked her, "You know this is your ex?" And she said, "Yeah," and to not worry about it. She admitted it was, telling me not to worry. At this point, he started banging on the side of the house on the other end. The pounding shifted to the side of the house, but she didn't flinch, her eyes fixed on me, urging me back to bed. And she didn't seem at all scared. Kept trying to get me to go back to her bed. I wasn't buying it. Her calm was unnatural, her story unraveling. I didn't want to call the cops because for all I know, this dude was a cop. Or she'd know the cops that showed up who would take her side. Calling the police felt risky. She worked at the station. And what if her ex was connected? I also couldn't just leave because my car was at the bar, and I was terrified. My car was still at the bar, and I was trapped, fear clawing at me. At this point, I started calling her out for the door not being locked, the cereal, and I openly called her a liar. I confronted her, pointing to the unlocked door, the fresh cereal, her lies. She couldn't come up with any logical answers, and I had no idea what I was into. She stammered, her excuses thin, and I knew I was in danger. I shouldn't have done this, but my fight or flight was pretty much kicked in. My instincts screamed. This wasn't just an ex, it was a setup, and I told her, if this is a robbery or some kind of setup, I promise I'll kill you both. I wasn't a tough guy, but I needed her to know I'd fight. I'm not a hard ass or anything, but my fear told me to let her know that no matter what it was, they'd have a fight on their hands. My mind raced. Robbery. A sick game. Something worse? My thoughts of what were going to happen to me were all over the place. I pulled out my phone, secretly ordering an Uber, keeping her talking to buy time. I ordered an Uber off my phone and didn't tell her. I just kept arguing with her and asking her what was going on, hoping to just keep her talking and in the room. I stayed by the door, ready to bolt. I stayed right next to the door so I could leave ASAP. My jacket and shoes were close, and I dressed quickly, never taking my eyes off her. Luckily, I never got my pants off, and my jacket and shoes were right by the door, so I was able to get dressed. The Uber's headlights flashed outside, and I didn't hesitate. The Uber showed up, and without saying anything, I just opened the door and ran out there as fast as I could. I sprinted to the car, glancing back to see her standing in the doorway, her face unreadable. I looked back at the door, and she was just standing there. I slammed the door shut, the driver peeling out as I caught my breath. It's only been a little over a month, but I honestly have no idea what I got into. It wasn't just a crazy ex. Her lies, her calm. The setup screamed something darker. Maybe a robbery, or worse. I don't believe the story of just a girl with a crazy ex based off of the factors I told you. It feels like either a robbery or some weird fetishized cuck thing. I beat myself up for it. A 9-year vet walking into a trap. Definitely something I'm very mad at myself for. I mean, I'm a 9-year Navy vet and allowed myself to get into a situation like that. In the Uber, I reported her dating profile, my hands still shaking. I reported her account on the Uber ride back to the bar. At the bar, I told the bartender everything, hoping they'd watch for her. I told the bartender as well about what happened just in case they saw her in there ever again. I haven't been back, haven't dated since. The city I loved feels different now, its streets hiding secrets I can't unsee. Some nights, when I close my eyes, I hear that pounding, see her standing in the doorway, and wonder what she really wanted and who was waiting outside. The Airbnb that wasn't safe, the streets of southern France wound through quiet neighborhoods, their charm fading as I dragged my suitcase toward an Airbnb I'd booked last minute. I was visiting family but craved solitude, avoiding their offer to stay for reasons I kept private. I was visiting family in southern France, and I didn't want to stay at their place even if they offered for personal reasons that I won't share here. Hotels were pricey, so I turned to Airbnb, always choosing standalone flats to ensure privacy. Even when I would book Airbnbs, I would always search for flats or studio flats, and not a room in the flat house where other people live, as I want to be on my own. This one, within walking distance of my relatives, seemed perfect. A ground floor flat with a garden, affordable and convenient. So I booked this Airbnb within walking distance to where my family members stay. It looks very nice on paper. I think it was marketed as a house or ground floor or flat, with access to a yard and a garden. But as I stood outside, waiting, a chill unrelated to the evening air settled in. It was probably one of those cheaper options. The house was tucked at the end of a narrow street, its yard overgrown, the neighborhood silent. There were not a lot of reviews, but the few ones were pretty positive. I waited an hour, suitcase at my feet, texting the landlord who was nowhere to be found. I contact the landlord who should give me the keys, but he's late. I spent at least 1 hour waiting outside. The area felt safe enough, though I'd passed shadier streets to get here. I'm trying to be patient, realizing at least the neighborhood is pretty nice and seems safe, even if I need to walk through areas that are slightly dodgy to get there from where my relatives stay. Finally, he arrived, a man in his late 40s, apologetic but unsteady, reeking faintly of alcohol. The landlord finally arrives. He seems like a fairly good man and apologizes profusely, saying he was in another town visiting his cousin or friends. And time flew by. His first confession set my nerves on edge. First red flag. He says they were drinking and didn't have time to sober up, so he had to speed on the highway on his motorbike while being tipsy or drunk. He laughed it off, asking me not to mention his drunken ride in my review. He stops and asks me half-jokingly not to say that in my review. I scolded him lightly, but agreed to stay quiet, not wanting trouble. I get a bit serious and tell him he shouldn't be drinking and driving, but he says he really didn't want to make me wait further. I tell him I won't flag that in my review. He was chatty, overly friendly, guiding me inside with a grin. This guy is nice otherwise, and seems trustworthy, very chatty, and open to socializing. But then came the second shock. The standalone flat was a lower-level unit attached to his house. The second red flag is when he tells me I will be living in a small flat adjacent to the bigger house he lives in. My dream of privacy dissolved. He'd be right next door, but I shouldn't worry because I would have my own place, own bathroom, own kitchen, etc. The flat was old, functional, not luxurious, but I hadn't expected more. He shows me around. It all seems okay. It's pretty old. But as I said, I wasn't looking for a luxury stay. It sat below street level, accessible via outdoor stairs to the backyard. The part where I would stay is on a lower level than street level. Not exactly like a basement because there is access to a garden, but I need to walk down a set of stairs outside and get into the flat through the backyard. The bedroom's windows confirmed the sunken feel, grass level with the sills. This shows mostly when I'm in the bedroom, as I see through the windows that is clearly at a lower level. A door near the bedroom caught my eye, the connection to his house. Next red, or rather yellow flag, is when he shows me a door close to the bedroom, which is the connecting door between my part and his house. He brushed it off, saying it was locked, irrelevant to my stay. He says his door stays closed, and it's locked anyway. Not as a warning for me, not to try to open it, but more like you'll notice there is the door. It's useless for you. His chatter dragged on, my patience thinning from exhaustion and his earlier delay. We chat a little bit, too long for my taste because I was tired, and also still annoyed at his lateness. and I wasn't in the mood to socialize. He handed me his number, preferring WhatsApp over Airbnb's chat. He gives me his phone number because he said the Airbnb chat feature isn't that good and that it's easier to use WhatsApp. Then he left, and I unpacked, eager to visit family. I start to settle down, open my suitcase, and get changed before leaving to visit the family. Returning later, I planned a quick shower, but unease lingered. I then go back to the place in the evening and decide to have a shower. I locked the bathroom door, a habit I skipped when alone, my nerves on edge. I remember locking the bathroom door, which I never do when I know I'm on my own, and I recall being quite anxious when taking the shower, sitting on the bed. I froze as a knock echoed, my name spoken softly. I'm sitting on the bed, and I hear a knock and someone saying my name. Before I could respond, keys turned, and the connecting door swung open. 2 seconds later, before I get the chance to answer or even understand where the noise comes from, I hear keys turning in a lock and a door opening. As you might have guessed, it's the connecting door next to the bedroom. He stepped in, claiming he'd lost his phone, possibly left here. The guy enters and says he can't find his phone and that he might have left it downstairs. I was stunned. Had he come later, I'd have been in a towel, vulnerable. I'm a bit shocked, probably because if he had come 10 minutes later, I would have probably been naked, ready to take a shower, or maybe walking around in a towel since I'm supposedly alone. As a young woman alone, his casual intrusion felt like a violation. I know it might sound like I'm just being but keep in mind, I'm a relatively young woman alone in a house with a man in his 40s or 50s who has control over when he can get into my place and at any time. I stayed calm, insisting no phone was here. My suitcase, the only item in sight. I stay polite and try to tell him that no, I haven't seen his phone. I would have noticed. There's literally nothing except my open suitcase on a couch in the bedroom. He rummaged, talking fast, ignoring my discomfort. He still gets in speaking a lot, and very fast, while I'm sitting there, not fully realizing what's happening, and not having a chance to tell him to leave. He found nothing, apologized, asked if I'd eaten, and left. He looks around the flat, and obviously doesn't find the phone. Then he says sorry, and probably asks if everything is fine, if I had dinner or something like that, and then he leaves again. I sat, weighing my options, stay or go, knowing refunds were unlikely. At that point, I'm really wondering if I should stay or not, since I know you get refunded only if you cancel 2 nights in advance. Hotels were booked or too late to reserve, leaving me trapped. I tried to see if there were available hotel rooms, but it was already too late to book one, or they were already fully booked. I showered quickly, anxious he'd hear the water and return. I decided to take my shower real quick, wondering if he could hear the shower and deciding that he forgot something else to get in again. Back in the bedroom, I dressed fast, my eyes catching 2 chairs, one with ropes loosely tied to its armrests. That's when I noticed the chairs in the bedroom. There are 2, and one of them has ropes tied around the armrests. The chairs are in good shape, and the rope is definitely not there to keep the armrest fixed to the chair, as they are just loose. No repair, no purpose, just there. To this day, I have no idea why they were there. I tried blocking the door with the chairs, like in movies, but it was futile. I still decide I should sleep there for the night, and try to use a chair to block the door handle in the bedroom like in the movies. But guys, this only works in the movies. The handle moved easily. The door opened outward. I try with both chairs trying to pile them up, even trying to use the ropes one way or another. The handle can still go down enough to open the door easily. I hoped the chairs would at least make noise if disturbed, but my plan felt hollow. I think that at least if I leave them in front of the door, I'll hear if someone tries to open it. But the door opens the other way. Alone abroad. My rule was clear. Never risk safety. I'm clearly paranoid and anxious, but living alone abroad, my motto is to never ever take risks for my own safety, as I'm usually the only one who can save myself. So it's better to avoid any tricky situation. Past encounters had taught me caution, a necessity for women traveling solo. I now live in a city that's rather safe, but has had too many bad encounters. Unfortunately, nothing unusual for most women. To others, he might seem friendly, the ropes a quirk, but to me, this was a horror story's opening act. From an external point of view, this is a story about someone booking an Airbnb with good reviews, with a nice and friendly landlord who is just overly open because he likes to meet people, and the ropes are just a detail. I called my brother, who picked me up, my escape from a place that felt like a trap. So, I decided to call my brother, who came to pick me up around midnight, for me to spend the rest of my stay at his place. Locals later shared rumors of that house, tenants complaining of unannounced visits, items moved, whispers of a landlord with a darker side. Some claimed the ropes were for art projects, but others hinted at worse. I researched the address, finding complaints on obscure forums, warnings buried under glowing reviews. The flat's layout, so close to his, felt designed to control, to watch. I never returned to Airbnb, sticking to hotels, their locks and staff a shield against the unknown. That night's silence wasn't peace. It was a warning I'll never ignore. My brother's house became my sanctuary, but the memory of that door, those ropes, lingers, a reminder to trust my instincts. The wrong ride. The city was asleep, but danger never sleeps. I thought I was safe. Just a tired girl catching a ride to a night job. But some rides take you where you're not meant to go. My name is Ellie, and this is the story of the night I got into the wrong car, driven by a man who wasn't my driver, to a place that wasn't my destination. The streets were empty. The app said my ride was coming, but the car that pulled up wasn't what it seemed. I was too exhausted to notice, too trusting to check. And when I woke, I was alone in a crumbling building, with only shadows and footsteps for company. He came back, the driver, his calm a mask for something darker, and I ran, because I knew he hadn't brought me here by mistake. I escaped, but the truth followed me. I was never supposed to leave that place alive. I work in food service, front of house. So, in the early days of the pandemic, with the restaurants being closed, I was taking work wherever I could find it. An old friend clued me into a medical office that needed someone to come in and do a bit of light filing. I was able to go in at night to limit direct contact with people. So, I jumped to the opportunity right away. The job was a lifeline, a chance to keep moving when the world had stopped. Ironically, the medical office job had been the safest that I've been offered thus far, COVID-wise. No crowds, no chaos, just files and quiet. Or so I thought. I wanted to avoid the bus if I could due to crowds. So, I decided to swing for a rideshare app. The app was a promise of safety, a way to stay isolated. But promises break. I stood on the curb, the city a ghost town, my eyes heavy with exhaustion, waiting for a car I thought I could trust. I stumbled onto the block, looking for my ride. And to my tired self's great relief, the car spotted me almost immediately and pulled up, asking, "Uber?" while I cluelessly wandered up and down the street, searching. The driver's voice was calm, his car unremarkable, a four-door sedan that blended into the night. The ride was taking a while, but I'd only just moved here last year, so I'm not familiar with all the surrounding areas, and I thought nothing of it. The city was new to me, its streets a maze I hadn't learned, and I let the car carry me deeper into the unknown. I was pretty alert at first, so I was trying to pass the time by playing games on my phone and stuff. But the car didn't have a compatible phone charger, and I wasn't sure the building would have one, so I wanted to save my battery to be able to call a ride back. My phone's battery was a lifeline, one I couldn't waste, so I dimmed the screen, the glow fading as the city slipped away. I settled into the seat, the hum of the engine a lullaby, unaware that every mile was taking me further from safety. I shut my phone down into airplane mode and eventually drifted off from a combination of tiredness and boredom. Sleep was a thief, stealing my vigilance, my defenses crumbling as the car rolled on. I don't often take rideshare, so being alone with a strange driver often put me a bit on edge. But this guy had a pretty boring car and a very standard look about him. He looked a little like my brother, even, young, clean-kept, listening to jazz. Nothing that screamed. You know, you need to micromanage this trip. His normalcy was a disguise, his jazz a mask, and I bought it, my guard lowering with every note. When we arrived, the driver tried to wake me up by calling to me from the front, but I was in too deep of a sleep, and I couldn't fully distinguish it from my dream. Finally, he awkwardly grabbed my leg to wake me up and kept saying, "Ma'am, we're here now." His touch was a jolt, my eyes snapping open, embarrassment flushing my cheeks. I was embarrassed that I'd been that out of it, so I just gave a hurried thanks and booked it out of the car and into the building. The air was stale, the building wrong from the first step. As I looked around, I began to realize nothing was what I had expected of an office park. I had seen a street view of the building when I first looked up the business, and it had appeared to be a strip mall plaza. The image in my mind was bright, professional, alive. Not this. The further I went, the more loudly alarm bells were ringing in my gut. The structure was semi-dilapidated, and it was pitch black dark past the entryway. The walls were cracked, the floor littered with debris, the darkness a living thing that swallowed light. I expected some lights to be off in the nighttime, but not the whole building. I scattered across the concrete foundation, compromising what was left of the lobby area. Broken tiles crunched underfoot, the silence too heavy, too wrong. I clutched my bag, my heart racing, telling myself it was a mistake, a mix-up, anything but what my gut screamed. I told myself they must be renovating, and I followed signs for the stairs, after what felt like ages, but was probably just a few minutes. All I had passed was construction equipment, a couple of locked doors, and some smashed windows. The signs lied, leading to dead ends, the building a maze with no purpose. I was certain I was not going to find a medical office, and figured maybe I had mixed up the address. I took out my phone to double-check, but once I got it out of airplane mode, I could barely get a signal. The screen flickered, bars dancing, mocking my isolation. I kept moving around in the building, pacing, looking for a stronger signal. I eventually confirmed in my texts that I had written down the correct address just by scrolling back, which didn't require service. The text was a lifeline, proof I wasn't wrong, but it didn't explain this place. I stood frozen, the building's decay pressing in, my breath shallow as the truth began to form. Since I had only been inside for a few minutes at most, I figured I should try and get in touch with the driver, because if I entered the correct address, then it was only fair he should continue my ride to the correct place and save me the added fees calling a second trip. The app was my hope, a way to fix this. But hope was fading fast. Considering this was all his mix-up, the app was taking forever to load with my slow service. But before I could get to a cloud of reception, I heard a rustling sound in the lower level of the building. The sound was a knife, sharp and close, cutting through the silence. I was on the top floor, and the only stairwell I was aware of was the one I had taken up, so it would force me into the middle of the building. There was no way to exit the situation without encountering whoever was downstairs. The stairwell was a trap, the building a cage, and I was cornered. In an abandoned building in the latest hours of the night, I figured the chances were high that it was just a tweaker, and I had no desire to try slipping past a tweaker, especially when it was late enough they were probably on something. My mind raced, conjuring threats in the dark, each one worse than the last. I tried to get a text out to a group of friends with my address and a request to call 911 to help me get from the property, because I didn't feel safe walking in that neighborhood at night, and I didn't have enough reception to call a new ride. My fingers fumbled, the screen unresponsive, the signal a ghost, but the message wasn't sending. Reception was too weak. So, I gave up on getting my phone going, and I started checking for another stairwell, or even a window with balconies or dumpsters that could be used to exit the second floor as a last resort. The building was a labyrinth, its exits hidden, its windows barred or broken. In the event whoever was downstairs came upstairs, I scrambled over to a door with a stair sign on it. But the stairs were completely dilapidated, and it was essentially just a straight drop down to the first floor. The drop was a death sentence, the stairs a cruel joke. I backed away, my heart pounding, the rustling growing louder, closer, a predator in the dark. At that point, the worst-case scenario began to unfold. I heard whoever was downstairs begin making their way up the stairs. The footsteps were deliberate, heavy, echoing in the hollow space. I thought fast and figured, based on my walkabout, that the floor was basically a giant loop. So, I'd have to wait for whoever this was to come up the stairs, wait for them to come all the way up, and then sprint the opposite direction of where they were going and try to get down the stairs and out of the building in time to make it to the road without encountering them. The plan was desperate, born of panic. My body coiled like a spring. I was not anticipating being chased or anything, but I didn't want to piss off a druggie or have a homeless person who might be living there feel as though I trespassed and become hostile towards me, or even have any sort of interaction that could possibly occur at that hour in an abandoned industrial park. The stakes were high, the dark a battlefield, and I was unarmed. I held my breath for what felt like 5 minutes, but was likely closer to just 30 seconds. And the person appeared at the top of the stairs. The figure was a shadow, tall and still, blocking the stairwell. To my great relief, it was just the Uber driver. I figured he had come back for me, realizing he had left me in the wrong spot, a place that could have worked out to be dangerous. Relief flooded me, my shoulders sagging, but it was short-lived. So, I came out from the beam I was hidden behind, and I started to wave him down. But then I processed. There was no way for him to realize this had been the wrong address. The truth hit like a freight train, my blood turning to ice. My stomach lurched forward, and my blood chilled to slush. I made eye contact with him very briefly, and he was completely calm and composed, but breathing pretty heavily and blocking the stairwell down. His eyes were wrong, too steady, his breath a predator's rhythm. I froze, my instinct screaming danger, his presence no accident. On a normal, rational day, as an outside observer, I could think of a dozen innocent reasons he must have returned, but in that moment, standing across from him, I just knew in my gut that this was someone with ill intent. Logic fled, replaced by a primal certainty. He wasn't here to help. I can't remember much more from the ensuing few minutes, operating solely on muscle memory and instinct. I Superman dove for the second stairwell's opening and just let myself fall down the drop. The fall was chaos, pain exploding in my legs, the dark swallowing me. Thankfully, I don't think he'd seen where I'd gone at first, and though I was in too much pain to know it then, plenty was bruised, but nothing was completely broken. I staggered up, my body screaming, but survival drove me forward. I scrambled up and threw myself at anything that seemed like it could be the door. It was too dark to tell. The building was a void, its exits hidden, my hands clawing at walls. I was disoriented from the fall, and I wasn't in a calm enough mindset to think, to use my phone flashlight. Plus, in hindsight, some part of me probably knew it would call too much attention to my location. Light was a traitor, a beacon for him. Just before I was able to reach the door, it flew open with a blinding light beaming straight into my eyes. The light was a weapon, searing my vision, my heart stopping. My first thought, though not totally coherent, was, "There's another one of these guys." And I stumbled backward, trying to find something to hide behind. I tripped, debris cutting my hands, my mind a scream of panic. Before I could, a voice called out, "All right, this is the police department. Everyone get on your knees with your hands in the air." The voice was a lifeline, but I didn't trust it. I didn't believe it was the police at first. I was in such a fight-or-flight mode, and I had already committed to flight that I continued looking for ways to get out. But he kept shining the flashlight right at me as I teetered around and yelled, "Hey, sit on the ground right now. Hands out. Hands out where I can see them." His authority was undeniable, his tone a command that broke through my haze. He sounded so authoritative that I just automatically did exactly as he asked. I dropped to my knees, hands trembling, the concrete cold against my skin. He approached me and finally shined the light away from me. It took a second to get my night vision, but once I did, I could see that he was actually a police officer. His badge glinted, his face stern but kind, a savior in the dark. I tried to speak, to explain, but my words were a jumble, my fear a wall. Tried to explain what was happening, but first he started asking me all these questions, and that, combined with what just happened and my fear of the driver coming back, all snowballed into me, being unable to form a single articulate sentence. My voice cracked, my thoughts scattered. The night a nightmare I couldn't escape. He was even asking easy questions like, "Can you tell me your name? Do you have any knives, needles, or anything that could poke me? Would you rather talk in here or outside?" And my total stunned babbling in response at first led him to believe I was on something. His suspicion was a sting, my panic mistaken for guilt. He directed me out to his car, and once I was safely out of the building, I was able to start getting my bearings just a little. The night air was sharp, the squad car a sanctuary, its open door a promise of safety. I sat on the edge of the back seat of the squad car with the door open, fading out, while he stood across from me and asked the same questions again. His patience was a tether, pulling me back to reality. The first thing I could think of was, "Did my friends call you? What did they tell you?" And he explained, "No, nobody called him. He was patrolling the area and noticed a car idling outside of this building that's known to be condemned." The words hit hard. The car, a clue I'd missed. "Yeah, It's nobody supposed to be inside. And when they are, they're not up to no good. The building was a black hole, a place of shadows and secrets, and I'd walked right in. He was launching into a speech about how, if I'd gone to shoot up or meet a John, he had resources he could direct me to, and this was not an ideal place to do either of those things, and asking if I had somewhere safe to stay that night. His assumptions were wrong, but I understood. My fear looked like something else, but I was stuck on something else he'd said. Finally, it all clicked. The car, the truth was a blade, cutting through the fog. I spilled my whole rideshare story into a frantic word vomit. He looked around, and the car wasn't there anymore. The officer guessed the guy had driven off while we were talking inside the building. The absence was a ghost. The driver gone, but not forgotten. He asked me all the details I remembered, and I told him, but there weren't many. I'd been too tired when the ride started to track much, but the other officer realized I could pull up my Uber app and I could get all the information. The app was my last hope, a digital trail to the truth. There wasn't really enough reception in there, even outdoors. So, we sped down the road, and once I had enough bars, the app roared to life, and I had 4 missed notifications from Uber. The screen lit up, a lifeline in the dark, each notification a piece of the puzzle. They said, "Hello, I've arrived, and I don't see you. Can you confirm the pickup address is correct?" And I am flashing my hazards. And finally, unfortunately, your driver had to cancel. The words were a shock, my world tilting. At first, I thought the driver was so cunning as to pick me up while sending these fake messages and canceling so the GPS wouldn't track us, knowing I wouldn't notice because I was asleep with my phone off. The cunning was terrifying, a predator's plan. But instead, I checked the car details, checked again, and it was definitely not the same driver. The person who drove me there had not been my Uber. The realization was a gut punch. The man a stranger, his car a lie. My driver was somewhere else on the street when this guy pulled up to me. The policeman took my statement and said they would keep an eye out for the guy. But the best I could give them to go off was basically a young-looking Caucasian man with brown hair, sideburns, goatee, and a 4-door sedan, wearing a zip-up sweatshirt. Maybe he had a hood, which is like 1 out of every 4 guys in the city. The description was useless, a needle in a haystack, but it was all I had. I feel so blessed to have survived this near miss. Suffice to say, I do not take rideshare services anymore. Quadruple check your license plate and driver's name. You just never know. The officer's questions grounded me, his notepad filling with my fragmented story. I described the driver's face, his car, the jazz that had lulled me into complacency. But the details were thin, blurred by exhaustion and fear. The city was waking, dawn creeping over the horizon, but the night's shadow clung to me. The officer drove me home, his radio crackling with routine calls, a stark contrast to the chaos I'd escaped. My apartment was a haven, its familiar walls a shield, but I checked the locks twice, the driver's eyes haunting me. I called my friend, the one who'd tipped me off about the job, her voice a comfort as I recounted the night. She was horrified, insisting I quit, but I needed the money. Still, I never went back to that office, never trusted a digital map again. The app stayed on my phone for days, a reminder of my mistake, until I deleted it, its icon a ghost I couldn't face. The police followed up once, a curt call to say they'd found no trace of the car, no record of the driver. The building was condemned, a known haunt for vagrants. But no one had been caught there that night. I scoured the news, expecting a report, a pattern. But the city was silent. the incident swallowed by its endless churn. My friends rallied, checking on me, their texts a lifeline. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, driving, watching. I walk now, or take taxis, memorizing license plates, drivers' faces, every detail a shield against the dark. The city is alive, its pulse a comfort. But it's also a jungle, hiding predators in plain sight. I see him sometimes, in every sedan, every hooded figure, his goatee a flicker in my peripheral vision. The bruises faded, the cuts healed, but the fear is a scar, a reminder that trust is fragile, and the wrong ride can end you. Some nights, I dream of that building, its darkness alive, the driver's footsteps echoing, his hand reaching for me. I wake, gasping, checking my phone, my door, the world outside. The app is gone, but the lesson remains. Safety is an illusion. And the road is never what it seems. I survived. But I'll never forget, he's still out there, waiting for the next passenger who doesn't check. The next ride that goes wrong. The house with no locks. I booked an Airbnb in another country. I was going there for a concert. The trip was supposed to be a quick escape, a night of music in a foreign city. But the house I chose was a nightmare waiting to unfold. The room was cheap, so I knew I wasn't going to stay in a 5-star hotel. But it was only for one night, so I didn't mind, as long as I had a bed. I expected quirks, not danger, not a place that felt like a trap. 2 men, both claiming the same name, and a house with no locks. By the time I left, I knew I'd never feel safe again. That house still haunts me, its shadows whispering warnings I was lucky to heed. To start off, it already wasn't a great trip because my data roaming apparently didn't work in that country at all. I was cut off, a stranger in a strange land, my phone useless. I logged into a cafe Wi-Fi and planned my route in advance as best as I could. The city's bustle faded as I navigated narrow streets, my backpack heavy with anticipation. Managed to be at the house in time, rang the only bell, and waited. Nobody came out. The silence was oppressive, the door looming like a gate to nowhere. I repeatedly rang it and waited for 5 minutes. Each buzz echoed unanswered, my unease growing. I peered inside. I noticed the door had a slot for mail and looked through it. What I saw wasn't a home. It was a ruin. I was shocked to see an entrance that looked like an abandoned barn. A super dusty couch right in front of the door, furniture draped in tattered cloth, cobwebs clinging to corners, pieces of furniture covered in cloth, very dirty and extremely old. The air was stale, heavy with neglect. I usually love old houses, but that just didn't look like a house that was in use or prepared for guests at all. This wasn't quirky. It was wrong. He appeared. I wondered if I was at the wrong house and what to do now. As a super old, unwashed-looking guy walked towards the door from the street. His steps were slow, his clothes stained with time. I asked him if he knew where the Airbnb was. He mumbled something which I interpreted as positive. His voice was a rasp, barely coherent. So I asked him if he was Tim, my host. He said yes and opened the door for me. I wanted to believe him, but doubt gnawed at me. Well, I already described the entrance. The centerpiece was definitely the super old, creaky staircase that led to the upper part of the house. I followed, wary. I followed him upstairs. Each step groaned, the house protesting our presence. He was heaving and coughing and stinking of cigarettes, which wasn't exactly pleasant. But all right, his scent was a cloud, acrid and oppressive. The second floor was also abandoned-looking, super dark, with clustered furniture hung with cloth and randomly thrown together, and a super creepy curtain that I couldn't catch a glimpse behind. The darkness was a weight, the curtain a barrier to secrets. Another stair up, and we're in my hallway, which was honestly the worst one. It was a corridor of decay, a gallery of dread, cracks in the walls, old rural paintings, and crosses hung up next to them. The house was alive with menace. It seriously looked like the set of a horror movie. Even my goth heart, drawn to the macabre, recoiled. I usually don't have a problem with decor like that. I'm kind of goth, so anything darkly inclined is my jam. But this wasn't art. It was abandonment. But everything looked so badly taken care of. And I got major creepy vibes from this house. Every crack whispered danger. Every shadow hid a threat. Showed me the bathroom, which had a huge hole missing in the bathtub, tiling, and the wall. The grime was thick, the hole a wound in the house's core. Everything looked super dirty. The room was a facade. He showed me to my bedroom, which was honestly okay. The bed was clean, a small mercy. There were just a lot of creepy dolls on the shelves that threw me off. But the bed seemed fine. Their glass eyes watched, unblinking, unnatural. I asked him if they had Wi-Fi, and he said no, which really sucked. No connection, no lifeline. I really hoped they would have, because that meant I would have no way to communicate in there. I was isolated, cut off. I also asked him when checkout was the next day. He then said, "It doesn't matter." His words were a warning, vague and chilling. He then dragged himself up to the 4th story, which wasn't complete pitch-black darkness, by the way, so that gave me very weird vibes. I needed out. I definitely didn't want to get into the shower, so I just quickly changed and charged my phone. The room felt like a cage, its walls closing in. When I went to the bathroom, I realized I didn't even notice the creepiest part. There were no locks at all, not for the bathroom and not for my room. No locks, no safety, no barriers. I also noticed that there were so many half-used items that someone who looked like the guest before me had left there, like shower gels, toothbrushes, and toothpaste. They weren't amenities. They were relics. A random lash curler just lay abandoned on the shelf, forgotten, untouched, a sign of neglect, not like a "here you go for your use in case you forgot yours" way, but it just looked like someone left it and nobody bothered to clean it. I made my choice. I already made my mind up that I would definitely not stay the night in this house. The house was a trap, its decay a threat. My mind was just spinning scenarios. What if all these products were left by the people before me? Why did nobody leave horrendous reviews? The absence of warnings was a red flag, a silence too loud. I was super spooked. Every creak was a footstep, every shadow a figure. I seriously debated if I should take all my things to the concert because it didn't feel safe in the slightest. My backpack was heavy, my options few, but my back was really hurting from my heavy backpack. So, I just took my essentials and left the room as soon as I could. I left a marker, not without sliding a folded paper under the door so I'd see if someone tried to open it in my absence. It was my only defense, a fragile test. When I was coming down the staircase, I heard someone turning a key in the front door. The sound was sharp, a new threat. I was a bit confused, but in the advert, it said that a couple lived there, so I expected to see the wife or girlfriend of the guy I'd already met. I braced for normalcy, hoping for relief. Instead, a middle-aged man enters and says, "Hey, I'm Tim." My blood ran cold. 2 Tims, 1 lie. all I could think of. Then who the hell is the other guy? I fled. I mumbled pleasantries, my heart racing, and escaped to the concert. The music was a blur, my mind on the house. Exhaustion won. But not there. I found a hostel, its flaws minor compared to that nightmare. The next morning, I returned. Cautious, I checked the mail slot again and jumped back. The old guy was just snoring on the couch directly in front of the entrance door. His presence was a violation, his sleep a deception. I tried my best not to wake him up and snuck into my room to get my stuff. The paper was untouched, a small mercy. The door hadn't been opened, thankfully, and I finally left this godforsaken place. The truth eludes me. I found a half-used matchbook in my bag later. Not mine. Its edges frayed. It wasn't proof, but it was enough to keep me from booking Airbnbs alone. The house was a stage, its decay a script for something sinister. 2 Tims, no locks, and a trail of forgotten things. I escaped. But I'll never know how close I came to danger. I love solo travel, but that house taught me to fear the places that feel too empty, too quiet, too wrong. The night we ran, the streetlights flickered, casting jagged shadows across the empty road. Our laughter echoed. 3 kids sneaking through the night, unaware of the eyes watching from the dark. A car sat at the street's end, its engine a low growl, waiting for us to come closer. We were young, reckless, chasing one last summer thrill before school swallowed us whole. The neighborhood was our playground, its quiet streets a canvas for our adventures. But tonight, the silence wasn't safe. It was a trap, and we'd walked right into it. The sedan's headlights flared, pinning us like prey. Its tires hummed against the pavement, slow at first, then faster, matching our steps. We weren't just kids anymore. We were targets, and the night was no longer ours. My heart pounded, my breath sharp as we ran, the car's engine roaring behind us. The streets we knew so well turned alien. Every corner a gamble, every shadow a threat. We weren't playing now. We were fighting to make it home. This was no game. This was survival. And the men in that car weren't here to let us go. The night had teeth, and we were seconds from feeling its bite. My friends Alex, Drew, and I were having a sleepover. It was our ritual, a tradition born in middle school. We'd been friends since middle school, and nights like this always felt like a tradition. We sprawled across the living room, surrounded by pizza boxes and soda cans, the TV droning with movies we'd memorized, staying up late eating junk food and watching movies we'd seen 1,000,000 times. Drew's house was in a quiet corner of town, the kind of place where the biggest scandal was a missing mailbox. I lived in a small, quiet neighborhood where nothing ever really happened. The idea to sneak out came from Drew, his eyes glinting with mischief. Drew suggested we sneak out and walk to the park a few blocks away. The park was close, a safe bet for a late-night adventure. None of us wanted the summer to end on a boring note, so we agreed. We slipped out, the night cool against our skin, the streetlights painting the road in soft gold. We were walking down the road, laughing and joking, keeping our voices low but not low enough. The air buzzed with cicadas, their hum a steady pulse. The streetlights cast long shadows, and the occasional sound of cicadas filled the air. The park was a short walk, its swings and benches a familiar haunt. The park was about a 10-minute walk, and nothing about the trip there felt unusual. We spent about 45 minutes at the park, messing around on the swings and talking about everything. We traded stories, our voices bouncing off the night. School crushes, whatever came to mind. It was just a typical summer night. The walk back was calm at first, the streets deserted. The walk back started off normal. The streets were completely empty, and the only sounds were our footsteps and the occasional rustling of leaves. We turned onto a narrow road, trees looming on both sides, their branches knitting a canopy overhead. As we turned onto a long, narrow road lined with trees, we noticed headlights up ahead. A car sat at the far end, its engine idling. A car was parked at the far end of the street, idling near a stop sign. We shrugged it off, assuming it was nothing. At first, we didn't think much of it, but as we got closer, the car didn't move, it just sat there. The car's stillness gnawed at me, a warning I couldn't place. No one else was around, and no other cars were passing through. Alex tried to lighten the mood. Alex joked that maybe someone was lost or waiting for directions, but something about it felt off. We kept moving, our steps quicker now. As we walked past the car, we glanced at it trying to act casual. It was old, black, its lines sharp like something from a forgotten decade. It was an old black sedan, the kind that looked like it belonged in a bad AES movie. The windows were tinted so we couldn't see inside. Drew's voice dropped low. Drew whispered that they were watching us. What I asked. Drew said he saw someone move in the driver's seat. My pulse spiked, but I forced a calm face. We kept walking, trying to act like we didn't notice anything, but my heart was pounding. The air felt thicker, the cicadas louder, as if amplifying our fear. Then it happened. The car's engine revved and it started creeping forward. The sound was a growl, deliberate. Alex laughed nervously and said that they were probably just leaving, but they weren't. The car followed, slow but steady, its headlights a constant pressure. The car slowly rolled down the road, keeping a distance of about 20 feet behind us. We exchanged glances, our voices hushed. We all agreed that this was pretty weird, but I said we should just keep walking and stay calm. We walked faster, our shoes slapping the pavement. We picked up our pace, but so did the car. It matched us, never closing the gap, but never falling back. It wasn't speeding, just moving fast enough to match us. At the next corner, we turned, hoping to lose it. When we reached the next intersection, we turned onto a side street, hoping the car would keep going straight. It didn't. The car turned onto the side street with us. The car sped up, its engine roaring. This time it sped up. "Run!" I shouted. We sprinted, adrenaline surging. The world a blur of pavement and fear. We bolted, sprinting down the street as fast as we could. The car's tires screamed, gaining ground. The car's tires screeched as it picked up speed behind us. I spotted a gap ahead, a narrow alley between houses. Up ahead, there was a narrow alley between two houses. Without thinking, I yelled at my friends to follow me and darted into the alley. Alex and Drew followed, and we pressed ourselves against the wall, trying to stay out of sight. The alley was tight, the walls cold against our backs. The car screeched to a halt at the entrance of the alley. The engine idled. A low threat. A door slammed. Then another footsteps. Voices, low and sharp, cut through the night. Someone muttered something I couldn't make out, but it was low and angry. Drew's hand gripped my arm, his fingers trembling. Drew grabbed my arm, his grip shaking. We held our breath, the air thick with fear. I could hear Alex trying to stifle his breathing. Footsteps crunched closer, deliberate. The footsteps got louder and the men approached the alley. A flashlight beam sliced through the dark, sweeping the walls. One of them shined a flashlight, sweeping it back and forth across the walls. A voice called out, rough and commanding. "Come on out." One of them called. His voice was rough, like he was used to giving orders. We stayed still, our bodies pressed into the shadows. "We just want to talk." None of us moved. The beam passed over us, missing us by inches. The flashlight beam passed over us, but didn't stop. A grunt, then a mutter. The man grunted, and I heard him mutter, "They couldn't have gone far." Another voice answered, impatient. "Let's check the other side," the second man said. The footsteps faded, the beam retreating. Their footsteps retreated. We waited, hearts pounding, until the car's engine roared again. After a few minutes, the car's engine revved again, and I peeked around the corner. I peered out, catching the sedan's taillights as it backed away. The sedan was backing out of the alley, its headlights sweeping across the street. It turned and sped off, the night swallowing it. It turned around and sped off in the opposite direction. We stayed frozen, counting minutes, ensuring they were gone. We waited another few minutes just to be sure before sneaking out of the alley. We moved silently, sticking to the shadows, our eyes scanning every corner. None of us said a word as we made our way back to Drew's house, sticking to the shadows and glancing over our shoulders every few seconds. The house was a sanctuary, its door a barrier against the night. When we finally got back, we locked the door behind us and collapsed onto the couch. Sleep was impossible, our nerves raw. The rest of the night was quiet, but none of us could sleep. The next day, we found a post online, chilling in its familiarity. The next morning, we saw a post on a local community page. Someone had reported a black sedan driving suspiciously around the neighborhood late at night. The police were investigating, but no answers came. The police were looking into it, but nothing ever came of it. We didn't talk about it much after, but the night changed us. I still think about that night sometimes, about how close those men came to finding us, about what might have happened if they had. We were kids, chasing a thrill, but we found something darker. We were just 3 kids looking for some harmless fun, but we got a reminder that not everything out there is harmless. The streets don't feel safe anymore. And I check my rearview mirror now, half expecting to see that sedan, its tinted windows hiding eyes that never stopped watching. The beast of the psych ward. The abandoned hospital looms at the edge of town, its broken windows like eyes in the dark. You and your friends slip inside. Flashlights cutting through the gloom, but the air feels alive, heavy with something watching. The halls echo with your steps, each doorway a void. A faint smell, rotten, wrong, clings to the walls, growing stronger as you climb. Something's up there, waiting. You reach the psych ward, its double doors sealed like a tomb. A sickly yellow light seeps from the end of the hall, flickering, pulling you closer, despite every instinct screaming to run. The stench hits, a wave of decay that chokes you. The light pulses, and a shadow moves, just out of sight, but not out of reach. It knows you're here. You grip your flashlight, heart pounding, as the hall narrows. Whatever's in that room isn't human, not anymore, and it's been here too long, feeding on the dark. My friends and I like to explore abandoned houses. It was a thrill, sneaking into crumbling shells of homes, imagining the lives left behind. Eventually, though, we got bored of houses and wanted to go bigger. Around that time, I was also the first in our group to get a car, so our area of exploration had just increased exponentially. We'd always talk about this one spot at the edge of town, the old abandoned hospital, a long time ago, when the town was first built. That hospital was the center for all major medical needs. Since then, however, it became ancient and was replaced by modern emergency rooms and mental hospitals. So it was condemned. It sat in a part of town nobody wanted to develop anymore. So it was never demolished. The hospital was our ultimate prize, a decaying monolith whispered about in school, its stories growing darker with each telling. This being our biggest target yet, we were more worried about getting caught. So we decided to go there in the middle of the night. We all snuck out after our parents went to sleep. Then I went out to my car and drove around to pick up all my friends. Once we were all together, I took us to where the hospital was rotting at the edge of civilization. It was easy to get in. We just walked right through the front door. The whole place smelled like mildew and moisture. There was water damage and mold everywhere. And of course, in a lot of areas, the building was falling apart. The false ceilings were coming down. The windows were broken, and the walls were full of holes. We'd seen decay before, but this was different. Clinical, sterile, yet filthy. The fact that it was a hospital and the only lighting we had was the flashlights we brought with us made it even more eerie. Pretty much everything had been removed. So it was just barren hallway after hallway, leading to empty room after room. Only the signs on the walls told us where we were. The trauma ward, the ICU, the burn unit, and everything else in a normal hospital. Our beams danced across faded signs, each ward a ghost of its past. At some point, I realized that the existence of squatters had completely slipped my mind until then. In all respects, many areas of the building were perfectly suited for it, but I didn't find a single piece of evidence that anyone had ever spent the night there since it closed down. The fact that not even the homeless and desperate wanted to be there was deeply unnerving. I didn't mention it to my friends, though. We were all creeped out enough. The absence of life, cans, blankets, anything, felt wrong. Like the building itself repelled the living. After searching just about every inch of the place except for one department, the psych ward on the top floor, it was sectioned off from the rest of the hospital by a set of huge double doors. We all knew this was the cherry on top of the entire building, but we hesitated to enter it. As the oldest and the one who had taken us all there, I was the go-to guy to lead the charge. The second I pushed open the door, I was smacked in the face by a stench I had never smelled before. It was like every foul odor mixed together and turned up to 11. It hit everyone else, too, and we all nearly lost our dinners. The smell wasn't the only thing in there, though. At the end of the hallway, there was a light. Not a bright light, but the only one in the entire building. A dim yellow glow was coming out of the very last room on the right, and it was flickering slightly, like a fire. My stomach churned, the air thick with dread. I wanted to leave, but my friends forced me to keep going with them. I couldn't abandon them and get away with it, so I had to get the whole thing over with. We pressed forward, slowly and silently, creeping down the hallway. The closer we got, the more overwhelming the stench became. We ignored all the rooms on either side of us and headed straight for the source. Eventually, I could hear the fire burning. I crept up to the doorway and hesitated again before looking in. My friends whispered at me to look, so I worked up the courage to peek around the corner, and then I saw something I'll never get out of my head. It was an old padded cell, littered with bones of all different sizes. The padding was soaked with blood, urine, and feces, dissolved together, and rotten into the most toxic, disgusting filth imaginable. At the center of the room, in a rusty metal drum, was the fire lighting it all up. venting out a hole in the ceiling that had seemingly been clawed out by hand. The sight was a punch to the gut, a nightmare made real. My friends frantically asked me what was in there, but when I turned back, I saw someone behind them, standing just a few feet away. It was as close to an animal or some creature from hell as it was human, with snaggled, decaying teeth protruding from its mouth and scratch marks bleeding all over its body. It was completely hairless, and it looked like its ears had been ripped off. Even the tip of its nose was missing. The second I saw this thing, I screamed at my friends to run. We bolted away and went down the stairwell as fast as we could. After getting dumped out of the emergency exit, we ran all the way to my car, where I wasted no time speeding off. My friends were hysterical and kept asking me what I saw, but every time I tried to explain it, they didn't believe me. All I could do was drop them off and warn them to never go back if they valued their lives. I drove home. The creature's face burned into my mind. Those teeth, those wounds, that stare. I can't reveal this to the police without admitting that I snuck out and trespassed. But something horrible is happening in that building. It's no mystery to me why there weren't any other squatters. There's a freak living there, stalking the halls, living in its own filth, and eating anything that moves, probably even parts of itself. It ate those animals right down to the bone. I can only hope none of those bones were human. I couldn't sleep for weeks, haunted by what I'd seen. The hospital wasn't just abandoned, it was claimed, a lair for something that defied reason. Had it been human once, twisted by years in that rotting ward? I stopped exploring, sold the car, and avoided the edge of town. My friends moved on, calling it a prank, but they didn't see its eyes. I don't know what to do. I'd check the news, dreading a story about missing hikers, about bones found in the woods. Something horrible is happening in that building. I'd wake at night, certain I heard footsteps in my room, heavy, deliberate, like it had followed me home. The town ignored the hospital, but I couldn't. It's still there, rotting, waiting, and so is that thing, gnawing on whatever crosses its path. The scarecrow's keepers, the cornfields stretched into the dark, their stalks whispering secrets under a bloated moon. I was 11, skinny and wide-eyed, spending a week at my grandparents' farm with my brother Carter, who was 13 and thought he was invincible. When I was growing up, me and my brother Carter spent a week at our grandparents' farm every summer. The farm was a world of its own, lost in the middle of nowhere, with fields that seemed to breathe and a barn that creaked like it was alive. It was one of those farms in the middle of nowhere with endless fields of corn and a rickety old barn filled with hay. Those summers were our escape, a chance to run wild where no one could see us. I was 11 and Carter was 13, which meant he was always trying to act tough. The days dragged, heavy with heat and routine. My grandparents were strict, their lives ruled by dawn wake-ups and early bedtimes. Our grandparents were old school and believed strongly in hard work and an early bedtime. The first few days were a blur of exploration, climbing hay bales, chasing fireflies, poking around the barn's dusty corners. The first few days were kind of fun. We explored the farm and jumped around in the piles of hay in the barn. But by midweek, the novelty wore off, and boredom sank in like a stone. But boredom hit hard by midweek. Carter, restless and full of bad ideas, suggested we sneak out at night to the gas station 2 miles away for snacks. That's when Carter got the idea to sneak out at night and walk to the gas station a couple of miles down the road to grab snacks. It was a mistake. I knew it was trouble. Grandpa had warned us to stay put after dark, his voice low and serious. It was a dumb idea, and I knew it. Grandpa had told us not to wander off the property after dark. But Carter's cocky grin and nothing ever happens attitude were infectious, and I was too young to say no. But Carter had that nothing bad ever happens attitude that always got us into trouble. And like an idiot, I went along with it. We waited until the house was still. The only sound the ticking of the kitchen clock. We waited until the house was quiet, and we were sure our grandparents were asleep. Carter grabbed a flashlight, and we crept out the back door, easing it shut to avoid the telltale creak. Carter grabbed a flashlight, and we slipped out the back door, careful not to let it bang shut. The night was alive. The air was cool, sharp against my skin, and for a moment, I wanted to turn back. The cool night air hit me, and for a moment, I thought about turning back. But Carter was already striding down the dirt path, his flashlight beam cutting through the dark, and I hurried to keep up. But Carter was already heading down the dirt path, so I followed. The moon bathed the cornfields in silver, their stalks swaying like a restless sea. The moon was bright enough to fill up the fields on either side of the path. Rows of corn stretched endlessly, their tall stalks swaying in the breeze. The world felt too big, too quiet, the kind of quiet that hides something waiting. We weren't alone. Halfway to the gas station, we passed one of Grandpa's scarecrows, its burlap face glowing under the moonlight. About halfway down the road, we passed one of Grandpa's scarecrows. It stood oddly, not fixed to its cross, but upright, as if it had stepped down to watch us. It stood in the middle of the cornfield, backlit by the moon, its burlap sack head and straw-stuffed body casting a shadow over the path. It looked like it had fallen off the cross it hung on and was balancing on its feet. I shivered, whispering it was creepy, but Carter scoffed. I said it looked kind of creepy, and Carter laughed at me. "Scared of a dumb scarecrow?" he teased, his voice loud in the stillness. He said he wasn't scared of a stupid scarecrow. We kept walking, the path stretching endlessly, until Carter stopped so suddenly I bumped into him. A little farther down, Carter froze, and I bumped into him. I called him out, but he didn't answer, his finger pointing to another scarecrow in the field. I called him a jerk, but he didn't respond. He pointed toward another scarecrow. This one was different, shorter, hunched, its form unnaturally twisted. But this one wasn't like the others. It was shorter, more squat. Next to it stood a figure. Not Grandpa, not anyone we knew, and there was someone standing next to it. At first, I thought it was Grandpa, maybe checking on the fields, but I realized it wasn't him. It was a woman. It was an old woman, her hair gray and matted, her dress ragged and clinging to her frame. She was old, with gray, greasy hair that clung to her face. She wore a tattered dress that looked like it hadn't been washed in decades. She faced away, her hands caressing the scarecrow's burlap head, muttering words I couldn't catch. Her back was to us, and she was muttering something under her breath. Her hands were on the scarecrow, stroking its burlap head like it was alive. My legs turned to water, fear rooting me to the spot. My legs went weak. I whispered to Carter to turn back, my voice barely a breath. I begged my brother to turn back. He stood frozen, his bravado gone, his jaw tight. Carter didn't move. He stared at the woman, his jaw clenched. He muttered for me to stop being a baby, determined to push on. He told me to stop being such a scaredy cat and that he was going to get snacks no matter what. He took a step, and the woman's muttering stopped, her head tilting as if she'd heard us. He took one step forward, and the woman suddenly stopped muttering. Her head tilted slightly, like she'd heard us. I held my breath. Hoping she'd stay focused on the scarecrow. But her head snapped toward us, her face a mask of pale, wrinkled skin, her eyes dark pits, her toothless grin splitting her face. But then her head snapped towards us. Her face was pale and wrinkled, her eyes sunken and dark. Her mouth twisted into a wide smile, showing gums where her teeth should have been. Her laugh was a jagged, guttural sound that clawed at my insides. She let out a cackling laugh that made my stomach drop. She charged, her bare feet pounding the earth, her dress flapping like a tattered flag. Then she started running at us. Carter's scream pierced the night, high and panicked. As we turned and ran, Carter let out a high-pitched scream and spun around. We bolted down the path, the flashlight bouncing wildly in Carter's hand. Her footsteps echoed behind us, relentless, the sound of pursuit driving us faster. I could hear her footsteps behind us, the sound of bare feet slapping against dirt. I didn't look back, my lungs burning, my legs screaming. I didn't dare look back. My chest burned, and my legs felt like jelly. But fear kept me moving. We reached the house, Carter's hand shaking as he wrestled with the door. We reached the house, and Carter fumbled with the back door. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip the handle. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting her claw-like hands to grab me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see her right behind us. But the fields were empty, the night swallowing her. But when I finally looked, she wasn't there. The fields were empty. We stumbled inside, slamming the door, our breaths ragged. Carter yanked the door open and we stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind us. The house was silent, save for the hum of the fridge. We stood there gasping for air, listening for any sign of her outside. But all we could hear was the hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen. Grandpa appeared, his face stern, furious we'd snuck out. Our grandpa came down in his robe. He was pissed at us for sneaking out. So we didn't tell him about the woman. We didn't tell him about her, too scared to explain. After a thorough talking to, he sent us to bed. We climbed into bed, pulling the covers tight, grateful for the locked doors. Me and Carter lay in our beds, covered up to our chins, thankful to be back inside the safe, locked house. But it wasn't over. I thought the scary part of the night was over. A faint tapping broke the silence, like nails on glass. But then I heard a tapping at the window. My chest tightened, fear stealing my breath. I felt the breath get sucked out of my chest. Carter and I sat up, eyes locked in terror. Me and Carter both sat up and looked at each other. The window's red curtain swayed, shadows moving behind it. We glanced at the window. It was covered with a long red curtain, but there looked to be the shadow of movement behind it. The tapping continued. Carter slid out of bed, his face pale but determined. Carter slipped out of his bed. I hissed at him to stop, but he ignored me, creeping toward the window. I hissed at him to get away from the window, but he ignored me. His hand trembled as he reached for the curtain. He crept toward it. His hand reached out. He yanked it back. Moonlight flooding the room. Carter yanked back the curtain. Moonlight spilled in the room. What we saw froze us, and I saw something that still terrifies me to this day. The woman pressed her nose to the glass, her toothless grin wide, her eyes glinting like wet stones. The woman stood at the window, her nose pressed against the glass. Beside her stood a man, his face filthy, wearing the tattered clothes of Grandpa's scarecrow. And beside her was a scarecrow, only it wasn't a scarecrow at all. but a dirty man wearing the clothes off of one of my grandpa's scarecrows. His grimy finger tapped the glass, his smile a twisted mirror of hers. He tapped a grimy finger against the glass, grinning wide. The first scarecrow we'd seen. It was him, standing, watching us all along. To my horror, I realized that the scarecrow me and Carter had seen standing on its feet was the man in front of us. He'd been watching us. We screamed, the sound tearing from our throats. Carter and I both screamed. Their laughter echoed, sharp and mocking. The two freaks began to cackle. We ran to our grandparents' room, our panic waking them. Me and Carter ran to my grandparents' bedroom, but by the time we all got back, they were gone. The window was empty, the night still. Me and Carter finally told our grandpa the whole truth. Grandpa was furious but focused, demanding answers. He was understandably upset, but more focused on finding out who those weirdos were. Grandma called the police, who scoured the farm but found nothing. My grandma called the cops while my grandpa talked to us, and they came and looked the whole farm over. They didn't find the old people. The only clue was a scarecrow, its clothes torn, lying in the dirt. The only thing out of order on the farm was one of my grandpa's scarecrows, tossed to the ground with its clothes ripped off. Years later, the farm hasn't changed, but I have. Even now, years later, I still think about that night. Every visit, I catch myself staring at the scarecrows, their burlap faces too still, waiting for them to move. Every time I visit Grandpa's farm, I find myself glancing at the scarecrows, half expecting it to turn into that man and for the woman to appear beside him. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but their laughter still haunts me. I don't know who they were or why they were out there, but one thing's for sure. I'll never walk down that path at night again. The fields, once a playground, now hold shadows I can't shake, and I wonder if they're still out there, tending their scarecrows under the moon. Thank you for listening till the end. Tomas, if you hear a knock at 3 a.m. tonight, don't answer it. Maybe the next story is coming. Symbiotes for you. See you the Sympoides in your next nightmare.